ability to keep people safe. Following George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis in May of 2020, the attitude amongst the city's political class shifted from criticism of the police to outright hostility, it seemed, with many subscribing to the defund the police mantra. Since last spring, the department sustained cuts in our authorized uniform headcount from roughly 37,000 to about 35,860 people. As of today, because of class cancellations last spring, we are nearly 700 officers below the headcount and more than 1,800 below the former headcount. Given the challenges of recruiting and the time it takes to train new recruits, it's going to take a while for us to recover. We also sustained a severe cut in overtime. So we have fewer cops and fewer resources to fill the resulting staffing gaps. Moreover, even before Mr. Floyd's death, a series of laws and policy decisions at the state and local levels effectively undercut the time-honored police methods for managing crime. These include bail reform that greatly increased the number of violent recidivist criminals who must be released pending trial, discovery reforms that require the release of the names of victims and witnesses in cases, as well as increasing the burden on police and prosecutors to meet deadlines for turning over evidence to the defense. And the decision by prosecutors in several New York City counties to cease prosecution of lesser crimes, including the dismissal of most of the cases against people arrested for taking part in the extensive looting that occurred in May and June of 2020. These and other changes have made it much more difficult to suppress crime and violent spikes, as the NYPD has done many times in the past. As I recounted for you last October, the NYPD has been proactive with respect to its police reform agenda. Since Bill Bratton came back in as police commissioner in 2014, we have pursued a vigorous reform agenda, which has continued under Bratton's successors, Jimmy O'Neill, and now under Dermot Shea. One major thrust of our reforms was to greatly reduce the NYPD's enforcement footprint while simultaneously cutting crime, and especially violent crime. Arrests, stops, and summonses are all down demonstrably. For example, in 2019, before the arrest declines caused by COVID in 2020, the NYPD arrested 148,000 fewer people of color than in 2013. This was the largest drop ever in NYPD enforcement. Yet, as a result of our more focused precision enforcement efforts, we also saw the biggest drop in violent crime since the mid-1990s. And during the past 7 years, the city has recorded 70-year lows in murder, auto theft, and burglary, as well as a 55-year low in robbery and record lows in shootings. Another major thrust of reform has been neighborhood policing, made possible by the most significant change in the patrol model since the advent of the 911 dispatch system in the mid-1960s. And when it comes to public safety, citizens and cops are natural allies. They have a shared responsibility, and neighborhood policing opens the door to closer collaboration, problem solving, as well as accountability. We are working more effectively with communities than ever at any time in our history. The NYPD also is engaging young people who are at risk as both victims and perpetrators of crime under a youth-focused initiative led by Commissioner Shea. Youth coordination officers have been designated in every precinct. They reach out to young people and their families and analyze and understand local youth crime problems and intervene with young chronic offenders to interrupt cycles of violence and retaliation. Connecting with young people, both to protect them and to prevent youth crime, is the future of urban policing. And this is where the next increment of crime decline will likely come from. The NYPD has redoubled its commitment to our young people, and our Deputy Commissioner for Community Partnerships, Chauncey Parker, is leading our Kids First initiative. Kids First is a consortium of programs that connect with kids before any potential involvement with the criminal justice system. Our aim is to broaden the kids' horizons by focusing on prevention and identifying resources, pathways, and opportunities that will help these kids reach their full potential. Let me give you some examples of these programs. In partnership with the Department of Youth and Development, Youth and Community Development, and the 5 district attorneys, Saturday Night Lights opens 100 gyms across our city each evening for free youth and sports engagement programs. In partnership with the New York City Police Foundation, the Options Program helps build kids' decision-making skills and access career opportunities and internships. The NYPD has also partnered with the Department of Youth and Community Development for the Summer Youth Employment Program. Through a lottery system, the program provides paid summer employment in all of our precincts, housing service areas, and transit districts. The Field of Dreams program, which working closely with NYCHA and other community leaders, has used asset forfeiture funds to renovate 15 NYCHA basketball courts across our city. Working with these programs and seeing the community turnout has been an inspiration to me and others. To see the joy in the people's faces, from infants to octogenarians, and to hear their voices is humbling, and it's great to hear a kid call a cop coach. These basketball courts are more than just playing surfaces. They're tangible symbols, in my view, of the community cop alliance that is so crucial to our future success. All of these operational and community changes have been supported by extensive training and administrative reforms. With respect to use of force, the department has transformed our policy, and we now track all uses of force, not just firearms and tasers or pepper spray, but supervisors and other investigators review every case to ensure that the force used was justified. Force allegations filed with the Civilian Complaint Review Board are down 46% since 2013. And use of force policy is part of my portfolio as the first deputy commissioner. So the NYPD takes responsibility for every time an officer puts hands on someone. And the way I look at it, if a situation is serious enough to require force, then it's serious enough to require a thorough investigation and thorough record keeping. The department has increased and enhanced its training to support neighborhood policing. Training now emphasizes communication and de-escalation. especially encounters with emotionally disturbed people. We've also trained our officers in implicit bias and procedural justice, and we are currently instructing them in the duty to intervene in any police misconduct they may witness while having encounters on the streets. Our disciplinary system has been open to public scrutiny. The discipline records of all uniformed members of the service are now available online, and working with a wide array of police reform advocates, the department has published an agreed upon matrix of presumptive penalties to clarify how and when penalties will be imposed. People want to know how officers are disciplined, and they should know. And we do a good job of correcting and re-educating officers and punishing them when necessary. And now it's there for the public to see for themselves. The department is growing ever more diverse. And today, Hispanics and Blacks and Asians represent 54% of NYPD officers on the job and 57% of the patrol force. Women are 19% represent 19% of members of the service. People of color have comprised 60 to 70% of recent police academy recruit classes, and women have been 24% of our new recruits. More recently, in March 2021, the council adopted a final police reform and reinvention collaborative plan. The city's reform implementation tracker demonstrates progress on 135 different commitments made to both cops and our communities. Some of the highlights include the following: expanding the department's customer service initiative to all precincts, public housing service areas, and transit districts. Providing for direct community participation in the selection of precinct commanders. Overhauling discretionary promotion system for uniform executives. And seeking feedback when developing new police policies through a public comment process. In all, the NYPD is nothing like the reform-resistant institution pictured by our critics. We're actually on the leading edge of police reform in the nation. But we're not prepared to go along with reforms that we know will undermine our ability to effectively fight crime and keep our citizens safe. I said earlier that some violent crimes are up sharply. And I also said that bail reform and other measures were part of the reason that that is occurring. Shootings and shooting victims have both risen by more than 100% in the past year. And these years coincide exactly with the first year and a half of bail reform. Driven by the shootings, murders is up 37%. Roughly 90% of the people arrested for illegal guns are now being released on their own recognizance or on nominal bail, for nominal bail. Many other arrestees can no longer be remanded or held on bail, including certain classes of both robbers and burglars. And so for those who believe these policies have no impact on violence, consider this. In 2020, 228 people arrested for shootings, including 71 homicides, had an open felony case prior to the shooting incident. And you have to ask yourself, why are these people on the streets? The court closings caused by COVID and the consequent failure to impanel grand juries have made matters worse. Our long-term cases against gangs and other violent actors were effectively stalled for 6 months and are still moving slowly. Working under these constraints, it is very hard to keep the pressure on the shooters. The NYPD supports bail reform, without a doubt. Money should never be the determining factor in whether people are incarcerated. But judges have the power to remand violent and repeat offenders. Should have the power to remand violent and repeat offenders. And New York is the only state in the union that does not allow judges to remand defendants who pose a danger to public safety. And any realistic bail reform, in my view, any realistic bail reform proposal should include this provision. Discovery rule changes are also undercutting crime-fighting efforts. The rules require that prosecution turn over not only the names, but the addresses of victims and witnesses to the defense attorney for the accused perpetrator. This has a chilling effect on the willingness of witnesses to come forward, to say the least. But the worst impacts of discovery reform may be yet to come. This law was largely written by the defense bar without meaningful consultation with law enforcement. So from our perspective, the requirements and the deadline set by the law seem designed to trigger technical infractions. And these infractions can then be used to argue for dismissal of cases. Governor Cuomo suspended discovery requirements during COVID, but they are now back in force. And I would expect to see a number of solid cases against violent offenders dismissed on technical grounds in the coming months. As a matter of policy, the NYPD has reduced misdemeanor arrests by 72% since 2014. The department has supported the Criminal Justice Reform Act, which gave officers the option of issuing civil summonses for offenses that used to require a criminal summons or an arrest. Yet the department maintains that both misdemeanor arrests and criminal summonses are important components, certainly in controlling crime and addressing conditions that concern the citizens of New York City. In recent years, some of the city's district attorneys have decided to suspend prosecutions of many misdemeanors, including prosecutions for transit fare evasion. This has had the effect of undercutting the methods used by the police to suppress more serious crime and maintain public order. These policies benefit first-time offenders, protecting them from criminal justice consequences. But they also benefit the drivers of crime and limit the police capacity to intervene with and disrupt their activities. In effect, they undermine the department's neighborhood policing approach, which seeks to involve police officers in active problem solving at the neighborhood level. Instead of acting unilaterally to establish no prosecution policies for misdemeanors, prosecutors should collaborate with the police to establish workable policies that maintain the deterrent effect of laws governing lesser crimes. In any discussion of crime and its impacts, it should be noted that violent crimes in New York City are largely directed at our Black and Hispanic populations. Last year, 91% of murder victims and 75% of rape victims and 70% of robbery victims were Black or Hispanic. Nearly 97% of our shooting victims were Black or Hispanic. And surely we owe these victims and the victims of crimes in the future our best efforts to deter, control, and punish violent crime. And when well-meaning efforts to inform or reform the criminal justice system have a net effect of protecting criminals and endangering victims, then these reforms have gone too far. The NYPD has made a major good faith effort to increase the fundamental fairness of policing in New York City. And we have over several years now, without sacrificing its effectiveness. Safe and fair has been our motto. A city that is not safe can never be fair to victims of crime. I could go on and take up the entire session speaking to our efforts at reducing crime and the new programs we have instituted for our kids. I hope I've given you a comprehensive picture where we are as an agency, both our challenges as well as our commitment to communities that we serve. And I hope that this information will inform or provide some context for you as you convene your sessions later today. And so thank you once again for the opportunity to speak to such an esteemed group. And it's been an honor for me to address you again as part of the Protecting New York Summit for the second time. We certainly here at the department appreciate your support. And as you move to your panel's discussion, know that this department remains unwavering in our commitment to keep New York City safe. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, First Deputy Commissioner. That was really great. Again, that was Benjamin Tucker, First Deputy Commissioner for the NYPD. He seems to know a thing or two. It's like he does this for a living or something, right? That was a great crash course in where the NYPD is right now on all these different public safety issues. Thanks again, and we hope we'll see you in person maybe next year at our next public safety.
I'd love to join you. Thank you.
Sweet. Thanks so much again. You have a great day. And now we're, you know, there's been so much talk about what infrastructure is. And obviously it's really important for how New Yorkers live and just how society functions. And it could be anything from a bridge to the internet we use right here to have this great event. And obviously public safety can really be jeopardized by a lack of security around our infrastructure itself, whatever it is. So let's dissect exactly what that means. What does it mean to protect New York's infrastructure? We got a heavy hitter colleague of mine, Annie McDonough, tech and policy reporter, to moderate our next discussion on this very topic. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Annie?
Thanks very much, Zach. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Annie McDonough. As Zach mentioned, City and State's tech and policy reporter. Very excited to moderate this panel on protecting New York's infrastructure. As Zach intimated, that's of course a wide-ranging topic and there's a lot to get to. So I won't waste too much time before starting off. I'll just remind the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to leave a few minutes at the end to get to those. We have a great panel here today. I want to start tackling this massive question of how to protect New York's infrastructure, taking a look at national security. We're coming up on the anniversary of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, and the landscape of threats has obviously changed and evolved since then. I want to start out by asking panelists, what are the security threats that New York is focused on, or perhaps should be most focused on right now? Maybe we can just go around and I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves as you answer, and I'll let a volunteer start here, whoever would like to start.
I'll be fine to go. Roger Perino, the director at the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey. 20 years have gone by since the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. and the plane that went down to Pennsylvania. Terrorism is still an issue. The tactics may change. The reasons for the terrorism's changed, but it all comes down to protecting the people of New York and New Jersey, and the protecting the infrastructure. So we weren't familiar with the vehicle rammings 20 years ago. We weren't familiar with drone issues, but we are today. Firearms has always been an issue, but now you have certain terrorist groups pushing for bladed weapons. That becomes an issue. And then, of course, 20 years ago, we were very concerned about foreign terrorism, foreign attacks, and now there's a big reason to be concerned about domestic terrorism and which that brings to the table.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Murphy, are you on? We can go to you next.
Sure. So Pat Murphy, Commissioner Homeland Security and Emergency Services for the state of New York. I'm into my third year here with New York, but not a stranger previous to this. Back in 2010 to 2016, I was responsible for the National Guard and military forces of New York, and then went down to the Pentagon for 3 years before retiring. You know, when you ask about the threats to New York, Roger's really kind of touched on what we're really looking at. And I mean, we're concerned about foreign actors that would do us harm in New York. We track what we can in the environments that we have, and what we discuss in a number of forums, what that threat would look like to us. And many times that is who we're tracking for the threat here. But more importantly, and probably more serious to us, are independent actors or extremist groups that are domestic. And we have a number of those that are viewed in New York itself. I think if you look at January 6th at the White House, and you look at those that have been charged in what looks like an insurrection, you'll see that there's a number of those that came out of New York. And so they may have taken action in DC, but we're also worried about what happens in New York with those. So that domestic violent extremist is somebody that we pay a lot of attention to as we go forward as well. So I'll stop there and turn it to someone else.
Hi, Pat Warren here. I'm the Chief Safety and Security at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, MTA, in the city. Like the commissioner, I've been here coming on 3 years, and I'm also not a stranger to work in security previous life. The one area that I would that we do focus on, and that hasn't been mentioned yet, is this idea of active shooters. If if we looked across the nation, probably the largest challenges that we've had in terms of security shortfalls have been shootings. And so while hardening the targets, which was brought up about trucks and other things trying to come into some of our spaces, trying to make sure that we're protected. We have systems to detect active shooter weapons and the like, is a big part of also what we're doing right now.
Jumping in right there after Mr. Warren. Gary Coolish, Berkeley College. I'm the chair of Justice Studies and National Security within the School of Professional Studies. It's important to add to what you just said about active shooters there. And within the past 18 months, we've seen the role of a local police officer in this country change dramatically with the pandemic and social movements and threat of terrorism and things that could arise anywhere within the country at any time. based on a social media post or a news crew being present at a certain time. Something as the murder of George Floyd, made international, and every local police department had to begin to take action, prepare for things that may occur in their town. And as the deputy commissioner briefly said, it's a shared responsibility within the community, within the public and private sector, and that's where public-private partnerships come greatly into play, which we'll probably discuss more on.
Thank you. And last up, we have Daniel Krantz.
That was all very well said, and I think the only thing that I can add that's constructive is to keep in mind that an actual criminal or terrorist event is often preceded by surveillance, and it's very important that we understand who people are and whether or not they belong at various sites. Some of these sites are public or have public-facing areas. Some of them do not. And to speak to what Gary just mentioned, I think it's really important that everybody work together. And I think I'm probably moving your discussion along maybe prematurely, but everybody work together to manage this threat versus trying to take it on their own as individual organizations, agencies, and even the big private corporations that are critical to New York's infrastructure.
I do want to talk about that next. Daniel and Gary, what you were both just talking about, obviously communication and collaboration is essential in managing these risks. It was true on September 11th, arguably true on January 6th as well. How do we see security collaboration happening in New York, whether that is public-private partnerships or even at a simpler level, coordination among government agencies? Are there any sort of model examples to point to where this is working well so far?
Well, I can certainly speak to the public-private partnerships and how well it works. We established our program over 14 years ago under the leadership and supervision and continuing oversight of the Port Authority. And the purpose of the program was really to bring together all the stakeholders that that value the safety and security of the critical infrastructure in New York and around the country. So, for example, it's very important that the contracting community, the consulting and vendor community work within certain guidelines, and that those guidelines, or that standard of care, if you will, is set at a high level to assure the effectiveness of a program, and that those individuals, if they're screened at one place to work for the Port Authority at World Trade, when they enter another high value target, such as the financial industry and the infrastructure throughout New York and the financial industry, that there's not a duplication of effort that makes it grossly inefficient. So we're looking to bring people together and establish that high level of professionalism in the work that we do under standards that meet the best practices that have been developed over the last 2 decades since 9/11. And we do that in an efficient way so that everybody throughout the region can benefit from that effort, not just an individual agency.
Anyone else like to jump in? Maybe Roger, from the other end of that partnership, I mean, from your perspective, what is the importance of working with outside groups?
So I would stress the intergovernmental part. So working with other state agencies, city agencies, federal agencies. So the Port Authority Police are members of the Terrorist Task Force with the NYPD, with the New Jersey State Police, with the New York State Police. And the sharing of information through fusion centers, the sharing of information that we get with the I have an intelligence team, and one of my analysts works within the NYPD, so that we're constantly sharing information and sharing thoughts. And the key is to always look for trends and patterns and communicate them, because one may be seeing something, or you may be seeing one thing, I may say another, and then we put it together and it's a pattern or trend.
I would, go ahead, Pat. Go ahead, Pat.
I'll just say that similar to the Port Authority with the MTA, it's a collision of jurisdictions. We are, in our particular case, we not only run across all the boroughs inside of the city and well as we collide with Amtrak, police, we collide with the Port Authority, as well as all the counties and city jurisdictions that are up and down Long Island and up into Connecticut and the Hudson Valley. And it is really important to do just what you've described, and that is to have systems and processes where that we work together and we communicate well. And just heard a couple of infusion centers type of work, but I will tell you that one of the biggest things we do is truly every event that's out there that happens every day, whether it's a storm, whether it's a parade, whether it's a riot, whether it's some other kind of event that's out there, we continue to all join in at those particular points of location and work together to solve problems and make sure that we're not stepping on each other's toes. Certainly communication systems that talk to one another are important. Leadership having constant meetings and kind of coordination events throughout the year, and then that just boots on the ground kind of familiarity you get from all these other events. Commissioner.
So what I thought I'd do is just maybe give you a practical example of what we do in New York in terms of trying to keep New Yorkers safe. I can't take any credit for this. When Roger Perino was in the position that I'm in, and he really grew this program, but it's the red teaming effort that we have. It wraps around see something, say something. And we have a team that goes out and does education. And it's a partnership with the 16 counterterrorism zones that are established throughout the state. Members of those counterterrorism zones are primarily, but not exclusively, to the law enforcement or law enforcement supporting agencies. And so we go into the community, big box stores or other vendors that would have resources that they're selling that could be used as, for example, bomb making material or something like that. We go in and educate those staffs, those businesses, their employees on what to look for, what is suspicious, what is reportable. And then once that education piece is complete, we partner with that private business and the local law enforcement and go back out and test it by going in where we would do it overtly in the education. We would go in more covertly and test whether those items are reported. And to the credit of the teams that are out there working that right now, things had slowed down through the pandemic because of the contacts and the businesses being in reduced configuration. But again, it's spun up. In 2018, and Roger, you can correct me because you were part of these numbers. I think 2018 and 2019, there were 1,000 contacts each year, just over 1,000 contacts in all across all of the counties and in the 16 counterterrorism zones across the state. And so when we talk about partnerships, I think that's a prime example of public-private to make New Yorkers safe, as well as our law enforcement partners throughout the state. Maybe Roger, if you have anything you want to add to that one, I think it's a model, and it's something that other states are trying to emulate as well.
So if you like, Pat, I can add a little bit to it. So the one thing that we had, FBI support, state police support, and then all the local police departments anytime you went anywhere. So that was really phenomenal. And at first, people were rejecting it because they thought it was going to be an aha, we caught you, you didn't do this or that. And it's completely the opposite. Very heavy on the educational piece, as Commissioner Murphy said. And I think that's the key. I'm
curious, is there some sort of penalty for, if a private business does not report those items?
No, absolutely not. I'm sorry, you should answer that.
No, there is no penalty. It's all about education and going back and revisiting the business that we're working with. Typically, we get the management's attention pretty quickly once they've invested in the education for their employees, and then the employees don't follow through. But there's no punitive action taken in the test, but so noted and provided feedback. And over time, our goal is to continue to improve the reporting through the see something, say something, or the tip lines as we move forward.
Got it. Gary, I want to hear from you on this as well.
Sure, I was going to jump in based on what Roger and Patrick both said. Education is key. You get the component there, not just within the public and private sector, but also in academia. Prior to being at Berkeley College, I was with the Secret Service, and I was working there on 9/11, as many of these gentlemen were as well. So prior to the pandemic, Berkeley and myself met with the faculty in our Justice Advisory Board and created concentrations within critical infrastructure and public-private partnerships. So you can get a degree in national security and also specialize in public-private partnerships or intelligence. Critical infrastructure is one of which is what we're discussing here with city and state. And it's important that a lot of the individuals that get a degree not only are prepared academically, but they know what's going to happen or what it's going to be like moving into a lot of these agencies and organizations that are with us today, because they're going to have to hit the ground running, for lack of a better term. They're going to have to know these things. As the role of these positions changed, as I mentioned with the role of a local police officer in this country, the threats are constantly evolving. And I can't stress, just like the commissioner mentioned about education.
I'm curious if you've, since instituting those concentrations, see an increase in students taking those up?
There is, and actually a lot of the individuals and students that were coming to Berkeley and in my class and many classes, they wanted to go in law enforcement. They didn't really know what they wanted to do in law enforcement, or they changed after taking a number of semesters. They say, I see I want to go into Office of Emergency Management. I want to be a first responder, not necessarily carry a firearm legally or make arrests, but I really want to be available for public emergencies, climate change, natural disasters, things, in New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy, obviously the things that are the threats are evolving, and they're also intensifying, which I'm sure we'll speak of with critical infrastructure. The system is outdated and needs to be updated quickly, because we can only do so much with education, and the agencies and the practitioners can only do so much with what they have. We have to update an aging critical infrastructure system.
I mean, those are some really good examples you just mentioned, all of you there. I imagine, though, that there's always room for improvement, always room to encourage more collaboration. And I'm curious if you can speak to any remaining challenges that stand in the way of that, whether that's ensuring secure information sharing, whether that's sort of dealing with the collision of jurisdictions that you mentioned, Pat Warren. What are the remaining challenges to working together within the public sector, between the public and private sector, even, to manage these security risks? I'll let anyone who can weigh in there start.
I'll start off and just say one challenge, and it's both a blessing and a problem. The challenge is social media in some regards. Social media is a great tool to get information out, and it goes everywhere, and it certainly is picked up by the different security organizations. But it also contributes to people flocking to that particular site when we don't really want them to go there, or inappropriate or false information going out, and then can flame the fire on issues from partial information. So there's a challenge in managing our reaction to social media and using to its value and to its and to its challenges or its problems, as you want to say. And then I'll say this, and I'm sure others have other things to say, but just about New York City in particular is that we've got great, we've got great systems to communicate. We can improve them all the time. They're largely interoperable, but the actual physical movement often within the city is a huge challenge. It's congested at times. It's confusing, and working through how to make sure you have your forces in the appropriate locations to support problems that may or may not come up work with one another. You know, share, you know, somebody else's forces may be nearby, and they can support a mission where that you don't have your forces in place for, kind of idea. So that's an area that always needs some work right now, a couple areas.
So I also would add that we talked a lot about law enforcement talking and the private partnership with, but the one thing that has always been a struggle since 20 years ago is sharing from the intelligence division and the intelligence community, and the intelligence community able to break their information down and share it with law enforcement in a way that's meaningful and law enforcement can use it. So that's a constant struggle. And it's been, I think, the Department of Homeland Security does a very good job. The FBI has improved greatly on sharing information that way. And I think that's one of the struggles. And we have to remember that September 11th was caused because of the intelligence. Well, it wasn't caused. It came to being because the intelligence community in itself wasn't sharing.
I'd like to add to that as well, in kind of a generic standpoint. You know, I think most, if not all of us, have come through public safety backgrounds, and public safety traditionally has always been more of a response-oriented, recovery-oriented operation, tactically speaking. And I think that one of the things that we can all do better is shift more towards prevention and the implementation of not only information sharing, but programs that are geared specifically to mitigating risk, particularly inside threats, prior to an event rather than in response to an event.
Any final thoughts before we move on here? If not, I want to get to our next topic, but I know I said I would save audience questions for the end, but there's one that came up that I want to address now because it's on topic. We have an audience question that reads, what methods and technologies are you using to empower the community to actively and anonymously participate in the See Something, Say Something initiative? How can New Yorkers know how to best take advantage of this initiative, I suppose? Maybe Commissioner Murphy can start.
Okay, so you know, unfortunately, it's not high technology. It's really grassroots kind of work that's done every day, and we work it through information that we have printed up, postings. You can't hardly get on an Amtrak train or even through the any of the rail systems without seeing a phone number that would provide access to tip line, even calling in tips in an emergency type line works because it gets routed back to somebody that will record it and take action on it. But it's really not high technology. It's they can go in and the most of the tips that we look at, not all, I shouldn't say most, but there are many tips that when we see the report, it literally says anonymous tip from individual, this date, this time, and what action is taken to investigate or to take a look at those things. But but they truly are anonymous when they're coming in. If somebody wants to be anonymous, if they want to follow up, then it's easy enough to get follow-up as well. But it's really low tech, make a phone call or a computer entry to do that. And I think that's probably from our perspective, for what we're responsible for, that's what we're looking at. So, I mean, others may have other opinions of that.
Anything else? I think thank you. That I think addresses the question pretty well. There's a lot to talk about here on this topic, but I want to move on to a different kind of lens for protecting our infrastructure. It seems like in the last few weeks, months, years even, we've gotten some pretty good previews of what risks climate change and extreme weather pose to our physical infrastructure, our roads, our tunnels, and so on. We've seen some action, obviously, since Hurricane Sandy, But when it comes to these kinds of disasters and more frequent extreme weather events, what are the most urgent threats to infrastructure that you're dealing with, that you're looking at, and what's being done to manage those threats right now?
I'll start with MTA. So, there's sort of the winter weather threat, but so far in New York, and particularly New York City, those things are fairly manageable. It's more the summer kinds of threats where rain, flooding, and of course wind and tropical storms, hurricanes, and that kind of effect, rise in water kind of issues begin to affect our system, which has lots of either rail track in low-level areas or subways underground or the like. And so since Sandy, there's been a lot of work done to put in covers on vents and hatches on tunnels and barriers for buildings and basements and the like to try to keep abate water and keep it from having to be a bigger problem. Also, like having extra generators, moving them to higher ground so they're not subject to water and issues like that. So that's sort of immediate response to those kinds of challenges, but they're not going to solve a long-term challenge of the water rising necessarily, which is a bigger issue that quite frankly that we're not addressing at this particular point in time, but it's something that's sort of in the back of your mind. So weather remains a big issue, and it is, you're not always, and the other challenge of it is you don't always quite know where it's going to land within our environment. Because of the way this total region is configured, you could have a storm surge issue on one bank of one island and not have it in another location kind of idea. And so you're always trying to do your best to put it in the right place. There are still places that are probably now more vulnerable than others since we've gotten the low-hanging fruit, but there's still some work to be done.
I mean, obviously, for those of us based in New York City, rather, a lot of the focus has been on rising sea levels, on coastal resiliency, but extreme weather is, of course, going to affect the whole state in different ways. Commissioner Murphy, I'm wondering if you can sort of address, from a statewide perspective, the broader landscape for weather and natural disaster threats, what that looks like across the state, and what different approaches different regions are taking.
Yeah. So let me try a couple things with you to begin with. First of all, when we talk about climate change and where we're going with protecting infrastructure and that type of thing, it's important to remember that when we do have a disaster declared, there are a number of dollars that come with those disasters that we can use for mitigation. And most of, in the past, it was build back to what you had before. And in more recent times, that's really taken on a new phase in that building back to what you had before doesn't reduce the risk or the vulnerability of that infrastructure being damaged again. And so with these dollars that come in for projects, there are dollars that are associated with mitigation, and each one of these disasters has improved different piece of infrastructure. I'll use one of the very large projects on Long Island after Sandy came through, which is still being built out now, is sewage treatment, so that our environment is protected. The sewage plant doesn't go underwater again. And so there's a barrier built up around it. The infrastructure is built up off of at a higher elevation. So that's public infrastructure that's being funded and improved for the climate change that we see, to mitigate that risk that we would see otherwise. We also see regulations being put in place about building back homes and private businesses, where you see water levels, water table levels and water levels rising, we have building codes now where if you're building back, you have to build at a certain elevation and other criteria. But that's not just specific to Sandy impacted areas like Long Island. What's happened to us now in 2017, again, Roger can relate to this one, and 2019, where we spent most of our summer up on Lake Ontario, 430 miles of shoreline that's being eaten away by higher water levels that are coming out of Lake Erie into Lake Ontario, and just the amount of infrastructure that's lost. And oh, by the way, we happen to put a lot of that public infrastructure in some proximity to the lower ground a lot of times. And so in using these mitigation dollars that we have, and another program that's going on specifically from the state is called a READY program, and that READY program is building back with in more resilient ways. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to whoever else, is the BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, is where a lot of the money's coming from. The administration has committed a huge amount of money to this. It's doubled for this next year in grants. There was about $450 million that was used this previous round of grants. New York picked up about 29 million plus for those projects, but we see that increasing over the next couple of years as well. And again, that's all about building back in a more resilient way based on much of what we see in climate change.
Roger, it sounds like you were working on that Lake Ontario project as well.
Oh, yes. Yes, it was.
Fond memories, it sounds like.
That's exactly right. Fond memories, because it was the first time we were dealing with it. So it was something different than what we're used to. We used to tidal surge. We're used to precipitation. Yet this was just a death by 1,000 cuts. And but I think what I wasn't able to accomplish, I think Pat was able to accomplish.
Is preparation for these kinds of risks an area where we see a large amount of collaboration between agencies or even public-private partnerships? Is this another area where those types of partnerships are going to be important to mitigating these risks?
Sure, but you know what becomes important too is leaning on the education community of getting universities to have some studies, get you information on how precipitation is moving, how the climate is moving, how tornadoes are now moving east, and get their view on things that are apolitical, and you can more decide where your resources are going to go and what's doable.
And Gary, I don't know if this is something that you focus on in Berkeley, but is that something that's happening, do you think?
It is. We're a career college. We're really interested in getting into the career, so we're not a research-based institution. But that doesn't say that our students in the community they're battle tested and they've become more resilient. The agencies that are here with us today are very good at what they do with preparedness and mitigation, and they were talking about the budgets and the funding. But a lot of the students, especially New Yorkers in general, have been through a lot in the last 20 years. And as the threats and everything tends to intensify, a lot of the students and a lot of the communities have also learned from previous experiences, and they're not as reliant. And again, the government and the agencies at every level are doing a great job, but the communities themselves have learned and become more resilient and less, I don't want to say less dependent on government, but they've been more proactive in taking their own mitigation and preparedness into their own hands instead of relying on the government, rather, gassing up their vehicle before a shortage happens or before a storm comes, making sure that every mobile device is fully charged before something may happen. Reaching out to, using social media, as the other panelists discussed, using social media as a positive source of communication. If things happen, that they can communicate with one another or get the message out and share. And also working closer with and befriending their neighbor to be more reliant on a community and in getting a handle on the issue before government actually is on the scene.
Got it. Got it. We have about 10 minutes left here on the panel. I just want to send a reminder to the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the box. I see a few popping up, including one about cyber threats. And that is an issue that I want to get to with all of you. Obviously, we've seen massive ransomware breaches, even spyware operations recently. Cyber warfare is a threat to federal, state, local governments, private institutions, and of course, our infrastructure, the Colonial Pipeline hack being a good example of that. To those of you focused on national security, to what extent has cybersecurity become as much of a consideration as other kinds of security in the work that you do? And can you point to any examples of prevention work that you're doing in the cyberspace? I'll let whoever wants to start there.
I guess I'll take the lead as the tech guy on this. Cybersecurity is most definitely an incredibly important thing as attack vectors have focused on physical infrastructure systems, and unfortunately, it's difficult to work together beyond academia to understand those threats and how to mitigate those threats. But it's very important that not only government but private industry take that threat seriously, as so much of our critical infrastructure is dependent on those private companies to remain secure, as we saw in the pipeline ransomware and the cascading effect of that. So, technology is something that you have to take in-house. That responsibility in-house doesn't mean you necessarily perform it in-house. In fact, just today we're watching an incident that's affecting everybody nationally through the degraded service of Amazon Web Services. And it's one of the reasons that I've literally fought with my own technology people for 2 decades now to retain the autonomy that we have in serving our systems, and that we don't use those outside managed services for that exact reason, that you're more vulnerable to somebody else's failure. So critical systems like ours that are involved in safety and security and in operations, you really have to focus on assuring that they're secure and that they're always available.
I'll comment again with the MTA, and while cybersecurity, securing our data is really important, sort of to the idea of providing service. A couple of things, certainly our signaling systems and those things that move trains and to some extent buses, are really, really important. And if there's a good news, it's that if for some reason they get hacked and there's damage to them, no one should get hurt because there's fail-safes to shut things down. But it will disrupt service significantly, which, when you're in an environment such as we have in New York, and you got to get people back and forth to work and their jobs, and you're just in the hub for all kinds of movement, it's really important to the economy and to security and safety to keep things moving. So a couple of things that we're, in particular looking at right now. So one of them is moving away from some of the sort of on-site storage systems for information and whatnot, and moving stuff up into the cloud, which does 2 things. One, usually those systems in the cloud are much more protected, generally speaking, because of how that operates and all the effort that goes into it. Plus, from a weather sense, it protects us from damage from weather that might occur. So it's important to move stuff that way. The second thing is there's a lot of, our system was built a long time ago, and it's sort of been kludged together, like Frankenstein over the years. And so we have to, we are spending a lot of energy looking at those older systems out there that are running our operations, and slowly, I say slowly, as aggressively as we can, actually, swapping them out for systems that are much more up-to-date, modern, and protect that service so that we can continue to move.
Cyber's interesting because you're talking about a criminal element that we have to deal with, but now we're also talking about state-sponsored cyber issues. On July 19th, the White House put out a warning on China, and then specifically as it relates to cyber and infrastructure. I think you'll find that ransomware, they said, was a 300% increase in 2020, and I think a 30% repeat. So if you've already been a victim, they already know you're weak and they hit you again. But I think the bigger difference is the state sponsored. I think your next big war will have a lot of cyber part in it. Shutting down a bridge, shutting off the lights, getting rid of opening of a dam, closing of a dam when it's supposed to be open, just doing the opposite to cause disruption, interfering with the banking system, finances, everything else. I think we have a lot to learn, and this is a field that, everyone on this panel was somewhere either in the military or in law enforcement and the Secret Service. But cyber comes from technical experts, and then we have to bring them in and become security and get security minded. And it becomes a real challenge for all of us.
I wonder if you think that since seeing that increase and since maybe just an increased awareness in the national security space about how easily cyber threats sort of weave into the broader security threats, whether becoming security minded is something that we're getting better at, that we're seeing more awareness of the need to start, building those defenses.
So I think we are, but every time you build a defense, there's a new game that you have to be. So you have to be on top of this, and then you have to, and chances are your organization, whether it's private or government, doesn't have the technology or the knowledge to do this. So you're bringing in other people to do it. So it's a constant game of whack-a-mole, but it has to be done. And I think we're all becoming much more aware of it. And I think the pipeline was a big eye-opener for all of us.
We have.
Roger brings up I'm sorry, Annie.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, Roger brings up a great point, and it's not just the government entities and state agencies. They don't usually play, and I don't want to speak for them, but they don't usually go on the offensive. So they're dealing with an adversary that is always on the offensive, and they don't have to worry about putting up a good defense because they're just on offense. And then the same thing with cyber. It's not just a really elaborate pipeline attack. It's also misinformation and use of social media for whether it be ill-gotten gains or for spreading fake news or putting out information for mass gatherings, such as I hate to bring up the Capitol situation, but social media that platform was used, and people. It sounds very parochial, but people could see something, say something. If you see a lot of chatter, which the government is obviously monitoring, but people also can play a role in seeing that there's a lot of information or a lot of people. For example, a lot of the airlines were seeing that a lot of people were buying tickets to the DC area prior to that event. And that's something that all the agencies and the federal government are going to learn from and being researched as we speak. But, it's something as parochial as just people using social media for cyber concerns as well for misinformation, not just hacking.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to just sort of get one last question in before we wrap up, reflecting really on all the different sort of ways of thinking about infrastructure that we've discussed today. All of these prevention and risk management efforts that we're talking about, of course, demand a large amount of resources. To what extent is funding for these efforts a remaining issue, whether we're talking about terrorism threats, cyber vulnerabilities, or climate resilience?
I think the cost of these events has proven to be potentially extraordinary. And I think one of the key elements of public-private partnerships is that the government is not necessarily funding the cure-all for everybody. That's not realistic. So when you look to work together as public and private entities, I think one of the key aspects of that we've chased is to spread that cost out in the most efficient way and have that cost be borne as much, if not more, or entirely by industry versus government trying to be the savior of all problems at unlimited expense, which is not practical. I think that's a core aspect of public-private partnerships, is spreading the cost of these mitigation efforts across all stakeholders involved, and not just making it a burden of government.
I think you could, I think you could really look at this either on the front side or the back side. And I think the group here would agree. An investment on the front side is going to be way less than what we would see on the back side. When we look at the amount of money paid out for ransomware from just to get them their own data back versus what it would have cost on the front side to protect it, it's incredible the difference in that. And so we do need to do mitigation work. We need to do preventive work on the front side for cyber. On the funding dollars that we use for the state that are eligible for folks to work with, we've increased. We've actually set a percentage now that we put against cyber and cyber threats, cyber education, infrastructure to protect our systems. And so there is a recognition and some funding now being put at that. And at the national level, we have a requirement when we're using federal dollars to put that towards that as well. And so, Annie, I think the more we can do on education and prevention on the front side will pay big dividends to us as we go forward.
Got it. Thank you. I see my colleague Zach Williams popping in here, which means it's time to wrap up. I want to thank all of our panelists here for really covering a large amount of ground in a very short time. There's always more to talk about here. I'd like to stay on longer, but I think we've given a good kickoff conversation here for the day. Thank you all for participating again, and I will hand it back over to Zach Williams.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. They certainly delivered, did they not? Great discussion covering a lot of issues affecting public safety and infrastructure, but we're going to keep the conversation going from here. We got another great lineup of big thinkers, this time on public safety reexamined. And this discussion will be moderated by Summer Kershid, senior reporter at Gotham Gazette.
Hi, everyone. Do we have everyone here? I think we're just waiting for people to join. I'm just gonna kick off sort of this panel. Welcome everyone. I'm glad to be moderating this conversation today, and I'm so happy you guys could all join us. We have today Public Advocate Jamani Williams. We're expecting City Council Member Adrian Adams. We have First Deputy Commissioner Laura Kavanaugh from the FDNY. Edward Michael, who's an instructor and developer for Celebrite, a digital intelligence company, and Anne Mehra, who's a healthcare innovation leader for Splunk, a data to everything platform that uses data for organizational efficiency. So I'm going to kick off this conversation with you, Mr. Williams. In the last year, when we last had this conversation, we were talking about public safety in the wake of the defund movement, when conversation was shifting from diverting resources from the NYPD towards communities. In the last year, we've seen a concerning rise in certain violent crimes, shootings, and homicides, which has led to a sort of a backlash against the defund movement. It's a much more nuanced, of course, but we've seen the police budget increase this year. How do you think the perception of public safety, especially in the wake of the pandemic, has changed? And do you think the focus is too much on crime as a measure of public safety and policing as a solution to it?
Well, what I always want to say, I think the people who fed the quote unquote backlash, like really fed into it, were never really trying to get to the solutions that we wanted to get to in the first place. So that was just a kind of easy out. And I've always said my job, and I think most particularly the elected officials are on here, our job is not to tell people on the street how to express their trauma. Our job is to take that trauma, what they bring to us, and turn it into real policies. And that's what we have to do. So I don't sit there arguing over how people express their trauma. It's my job to kind of reflected and turned it into real policy. What I never heard was anyone say, let's defund public safety. And I think that's an important key, because what we've done far too often is equate public safety with policing. That's the damage and the danger that we always fall into, and that's the trap. And so we have to understand that policing and law enforcement, I should say, is a part of what we have to do in terms of public safety. It always will probably always will be. The problem is we've never fully funded or embraced the other parts of things that lead to public safety, never properly funded those things, never really changed the structure and the infrastructure of how we get to public safety. You look at something that we've been pushing for such a long time, which is who looks at CompStat and who doesn't. And the police right now are the only ones that look at that data. Something as simple as opening up to other agencies and community groups can just change the way of who we allow to be in the public safety space in a very real way at the adults table, and who we don't. And I think that's important. And I was proud to be the chair of the Task Force to Combat Gun Violence over a decade ago. And the things that, about a decade, the things that we put in place, the policies, the solutions that were funded, we actually helped become the safest city we've ever been in history up until the pandemic. Now, if you're a victim of violence, that data means nothing. So we have to be aware of that data, but we're moving in the right direction. What we never had, and one of the saddest parts I've seen even in this whole debate around defund or $1 billion last year, was we lost the opportunity to make the structural change that was needed. And I don't think this administration ever really bought into really changing that structure in a real way. And my hope is seeing now city, state, and federal really focusing on gun violence in a way that I haven't seen in such a long time, if ever. And I'm really hoping that we don't lose this opportunity and fall victim to the same old tropes that we see people apologizing for 30 years ago, and make that mistake that we have to apologize 30 years from now.
So that raises the question of, and Councilmember Adams, I'll turn to you here. Last year, you were one of the members during when the budget was being passed, with a very controversial, contentious budget, which revolved around the 1 billion, what was supposed to be a 1 billion cut to the NYPD, but ended up being closer to 300 million in the end. You defended voting for the budget, saying that you did not want those cuts to the NYPD because they would have affected the school safety budget and the largely staff of Black and brown people. Do you think that at the time you talked about there needed to be a more nuanced conversation about creating public safety that didn't sacrifice safety in communities of color? Do you think that conversation has happened in the last year? And do you think it's happened in this year's budget at all? Have any of the things that you wanted to see passed happened?
Thank you for the question. First, I'd like to say thank you for having this panel today. It's a pleasure to be on, of course, with my colleagues, in particular, the public advocate. And I agree with everything that Jamani just said, by the way. As far as the budget last year is concerned, the budget was tragic. In no uncertain terms, that budget was a tragedy. It was a tragedy for those of us that sat on the budget negotiating team, and it was a tragedy for the public that had to deal with it, had to deal with the city council, starting out with zero, with a blank slate, and having to create those things that had never been created before. We were in the midst, and still are, by the way, of a global pandemic. Even though we're trying to act like we're not, we still are in the midst of a very significant pandemic that we are seeing continue to strike our communities, in particular communities of color, still to this day. So when it comes to actually the budget, what it did and didn't do, the conversations are still absolutely happening. As a part of the team still, we're still having those conversations at the table, the budget that we just passed a few weeks ago. Some of the situations, too many of them, I should say, that we faced last year, we are still facing to this day. Again, I agree with the public advocate. Some conversations have yet to be had. We have got to have them. We've got to be serious. Public safety is not just about policing, and we've got to stop bottling public safety up with just meaning the NYPD when it means so much more than the NYPD. And just to go back to the original part of your question, which was a very good one, what my feelings were about passing the budget that we passed last year and the funds that, quote unquote, were taken away from the police or were not taken away from the police. I voted the conscience of my community. I voted the conscience of my constituents who want no part of hashtag defund, by the way, for a very good reason. I voted what I was hearing from them, and that is that all they want is to live together with the NYPD, not without the NYPD. What they want is to make sure that their civil rights are protected, that they are protected, and that they are treated humanely. So around this conversation of public safety has to come the conversation of humanity and equity. Equity is the hashtag these days for good reason as well. So I think that we've got to incorporate those words into all of the conversations that we have around public safety.
That raises the question of, without relating the past too much, what does structural change in public safety look like to you? And I want to throw this question to you, Councilmember Adams, first, and then the public advocate. Before I'd like to ask Ms. Kavanaugh to weigh in, because the EMS teams with the FNY are one of the things that the mayor announced in the last year, and that's one of the sort of structural changes in public safety. I'd say sending out mental health response teams instead of the police to respond to people in experiencing emotional crises. So what does structural change look like, Councilmember?
Structural change is going to take a lot of work. For me, structural change has everything to do with systemic racism across the board. And it's not just, again, with public safety, it's with every entity, every agency that we deal with in the city of New York. It is inherent in the DNA of the United States. And of course, it is inherent in the DNA across the city of New York. So before we talk about any kind of structural changes, we've got to face facts. And we've got to face the fact that there is systemic racism everywhere, on every corner that we work and that we live on, that we breathe in New York City. So that said, once we take a look at that and face those facts, we've got to take a look at the resources that never were, as the public advocate said. The places that we start out with are going to have to be realizing the equity and making that happen in communities of color, in places that have never seen it before. There is a reason that we have violence. There is a reason that we have unsanitary conditions. There is a reason that we have consistent mental health issues in certain communities as opposed to other communities. So before we can take a look at anything else, we've got to take a look at and admit the inherent racism that we're facing. We've got to deal with it in education. We've got to deal with it in health. We've got to deal with it in public safety. So again, before we can come up with anything else, I think that is the foundation and the bedrock that we have to deal with, because that is the foundation and the bedrock that we are built on.
Mr. Public Advocate, very briefly.
Thank you. Your first, I want to say that the first thing is to recognize that public safety is not equated with policing. And a lot of folks got to know the work I did around policing issues. On most part of the work I did around gun violence. And I understand now that there's no amount of reforms to the police department that are going to get to where we need to go. We need more accountability. We need more transparency. But what the problem has been is, while we're trying to reform a department, we're not changing what public safety is. And so we keep getting the department to solve all the problems that many agencies need to be involved with, including community groups. And I want to say this to answer your question, because I went to Newark, New Jersey, and last year, New York, during the pandemic, they had no increase in gun violence. They had no police shootings. I think they've had one since. Their Floyd protests didn't have the same results that we see in other cities, including ours. They were the one of maybe 2 or 3 cities where that happened. If you knew Newark way back when, you'd be shocked. And I called Mayor Ross Baraka and I said, what is happening there? He actually said, well, we're doing many of the things that you're doing over here, things that I've championed, things that we funded. And I went over there to figure out what is the difference. The difference was, we had a mayor that was bought in. We had a police commissioner that was bought in. We had a public safety director, which the police commissioner actually reported to, that were all bought in. And so these weren't one-off programs that were funded. These were everybody sitting at the table, the same table, the adults table. We have an awesome mayor's office of gun violence prevention, but where do they sit in terms of who's making decisions, and where what's going? They said every time they hire 10 or so police officers, they hire a social worker. Those persons graduate in the same stage as the police officers. They've made structural changes every step of the way so that the police are not the ones reliant that people are reliant on to solve all problems. That's something that we haven't done here. You look at the mental health, and the biggest fight I've had with the administration is they refuse to accept that we can have a situation where police are not the only ones, are not the first ones responding. We're doing some things, but we're definitely not where we should be. And it seems that there's a grip on us in terms of releasing that grip, understanding that police are not the only ones to deal with this. And lastly, I'll say, when it comes to funding, if you ask people the questions about where things should be funded and if they should be funded, they would say yes. And when we start to explain how much money is actually in the police department and where that money is spent, should we reallocate, those same communities would also say yes. And so whether you call it defund, refund, whatever it is, we have to stop asking the wrong questions because we'll get the wrong answers. So we ask people, they say, oh, these communities, they still want police. And what I often say is, yes, they've also asked for better housing conditions. They've also asked for more mental health programs. They also asked for better schools, but we've never answered those questions. NYCHD asked for more cameras before some seniors were murdered by a mass murderer who would have gotten caught. Why don't we answer those questions? And so I want to make sure we want to ask the right questions so we can get the right answers.
I want to turn to you, Ms. Kavanaugh. You know, one of the things that we talked about here is new solutions to public safety. The mayor's been very, the mayor's started the new program where EMS workers working with FDNY, working with health and hospitals to treat people, to respond to people in mental health distress. Is that a good enough solution? Is there more on the horizon? What can we expect? And what do you think the city needs to do right now to both build, provide public safety as well as build trust in the city's response to those situations?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I think I would springboard off of what the public advocate and the council member have said, who've both been very supportive on this issue. I think it's all about infrastructure and it's all about 360-degree solutions. So, we are very proud of this program. I am very proud of this program. It stems from personal experience. We definitely want people to have other options when they have a mentally ill family member, that not only is it not necessarily the police that are arriving, but it's people with additional skill sets. Our EMTs and paramedics are fantastic, and social workers who can really set up long-term solutions. And, I think that's what's required. I think you'll see expansion of this program. And that's, something I think the public is really looking for. But I would say that, no matter how fantastic our response is, no matter how fantastic our care is on scene, if we bring someone to an emergency room and they're in and out of that emergency room and there's no infrastructure for health insurance for them, there's no infrastructure for long-term mental health care, we will be back at their home again in a week or a month or, sometimes even in the same day. And so I think, when it comes to both this program, but also the larger issue of healthcare inequity, that's really where you have to go to solve those inequities. We can have a great response. And I think this program, is something that is going to be great for the city and will expand, but you really need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place for care for the most vulnerable members, after we respond, and ongoing from there, and in the neighborhoods who need it most and who call 911 most often.
I kind of want to move on to our other panelists. I want to give you guys an opportunity to talk here. Both Ms. Mara and Mr. Michael work in data and digital tools, about how to improve, in Ms. Mara's case, like operational efficiency, Mr. Michael's case, digital intelligence tools. We've got Eric Adams is likely to be the next mayor of New York City. He is a data-driven guy. He wants to bring a sort of CompStat approach to city government and improve, cut wasteful spending and improve how government delivers services. So I'll start with you, Ms. Mara. How do you think using data, how do you improve on public safety, and which aspects of city government do you think can be improved that make it a safer city? And this is, of course, not just limited to police, but I know your healthcare is your specialty. In the wake of a pandemic, access to healthcare, if people have more access to healthcare, does that make it a safer city? Please.
Thank you, Samar. First of all, it's truly a privilege and an honor to have the opportunity to return as a New Yorker today, albeit virtually. to speak alongside colleagues who are doing God's work, helping save lives each and every day. And for your service and dedication, I thank and applaud you. If you Google Splunk, you will come to think or may even know Splunk as a cybersecurity observability and IT company. And no doubt, we are definitely that. But as we learned earlier in the summit today from our first Deputy Commissioner Tucker, who kicked off the summit and described our challenges as a triple threat. One, the ravages of COVID that include the uniform sick rate. Two, the protests. And three, the steep increases in shootings and violent crimes and gun violence that my colleagues here have talked about. Our world today lies at the intersection of public safety and public health. And thus a coordination across a multi-stakeholder community of police, citizens, policymakers, state and local agency staff, and healthcare providers to help suppress crime and violence and ensure healthy living for all New Yorkers is not a nice to have, but a must have. And so if you would allow me to be bold and say, what we need in a post-pandemic world is an equitable, immortal platform, an N of N platform that yields not only a return on investment and ROI, but more importantly, an ROL, a return on life. And why do we need this equitable, immortal platform? Because, as my colleagues have said, we do not know where, when, how, and why the next unfortunate New York event or events emerge. And so within this immortal platform, we need the ability to ingest an N number of data types, both structured and unstructured, found in N number of data sources, both machine and non-machine, and query N amounts of data. Namely, we require schema on the fly. We leave the data where it is and how it is to protect the privacy of all. And we couple this N of N platform with hands-on knowledge and experience that's captured from the field, from the streets of New York City and New York State, and those situational rooms in which we find resources coming together from all departments, safety to health to housing. And we need to apply more machine learning and artificial intelligence equitable capabilities that are available to us today, whether it's in the form of virtual reality, augmented reality, quantum computing, edge computing technologies, just to name a few. And we convert this knowledge into algorithms, equitable algorithms, to not only prevent these unfortunate circumstances from occurring, and be they cloaked in the form of a terrorist or a spike protein or a natural disaster, but help predict these events before they occur. So together in these public-private partnerships with stakeholders like we have as speakers today, and technologies like Splunk, we will continue to work to ensure the safety and well-being of all New Yorkers. And most importantly, Summer, we need this immortal platform to predict calamities and unfortunate occurrences in near and real time, 24/7, just like the city that never sleeps. There is no room for error when we calculate a return on life.
I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Michael. How can the city use digital tools to improve on public safety? Are there any risks and concerns involved? What do you think?
First of all, thank you, Samara. Thank you for having me. It's definitely a privilege to be part of the panel here with the other respected panelists, and to the guests that have attended. I'm also, like Ms. Mara, a returning New Yorker. I moved away many years ago and never had a chance to move back, but I still have a lot of family there and still go to visit. It's where I kind of draw my roots from. My background is in a little over 20 years in law enforcement. Specifically pertaining to, I spent the first 10 years on patrol, and then after that, I spent time in digital forensics and collecting information from digital devices and as it applies to crime. And speaking from that vantage point, I definitely can appreciate the message of public safety, and I definitely, obviously, because my background as far as the defund the police movement, I mean, I have my own opinions on that, but there definitely needs to be more value placed on public safety and the public sector as a whole. There was times that I agree with what Mr. Williams said, 110%. Not everything requires a police officer's response. And there were times that there were situations that we handled that weren't really reflective of what we were best trained to do. And it was hard. We didn't really have any resources to turn to. Fast forwarding to 2010, 2015, 2020. Almost everybody has, almost all crime now has some type of electronic buy-in, whether it be phone data or computer data or video. One of the things Celebrite does, and one of the things I'm a big believer in, is taking all this data and putting it into a digital intelligence solution. So as a whole, does this benefit law enforcement? 100%. It benefits law enforcement and the communities they serve. It can act for quicker closure of crime, for the communities they serve, better protection for the victims. One of the biggest reasons, as far as digital intelligence as a whole, I believe in, is because it frees up, it frees up dollars, and it frees up value in people to go do other things, whether it be training, whether it be community outreach programs, whether it be other type of enforcement activities. For this, in this particular case, we're talking about NYPD. By having a method to look at and analyze this digital data, it definitely allows us an overview from all in one place for prosecution, for protection of the victims, for making sure innocent people are innocent. And probably the second half of that, a big point I had right before I retired with my own agency, is accountability. And this is huge. As people move forward and the police have gotten, law enforcement as a whole across the country have gotten to the state that they are, I don't want to be the one sitting up in the stand where I'm not believed. It's my word against somebody else's. And I will tell you, as far as 5 years ago, I could say, obviously not whatever I wanted to, but I could say my factual recollection of the events, the way I recalled it, and it very well may differ from what something showed on video or what somebody else saw. And what digital intelligence allows you to do is you still have the human factor, but I want to be able to show to juries. I want the jury to see the video. I want the jury to see the text messages. I want the jury to see the data and form their own conclusions. And as in case there may be any doubt, a reflection on law enforcement and a whole, we're still moving forward with successful prosecutions for violent offenders. And we're still capable of making sure that, definitely holding both citizens and law enforcement accountable for their actions in case there is something in that digital intelligence model that shows anything different.
So, while we're talking about data, and this sort of brings me to the question of how do you measure public safety? And I want to ask Public Advocate Williams, does the city need a more holistic measure of public safety? Say, for instance, if a year from now, the murder rate's down, the shooting rate is down, but we have more homeless people on the street. I mean, more people are experiencing homelessness, and fewer people have access to mental health care. Does that mean the city is safer? And conversely, if the crime rate goes up, but more people are housed and more people are receiving mental health services, is that also a measure of public safety? Do we need a more holistic measure by which to judge public safety, and what's an appropriate way to create that measure?
You know, what I would say is, one, we all have to agree, and it seems like slowly the city, state, and federally, we're starting to really, that's probably one plus from the summer protests we had. People are starting to really think about this in a more holistic way. Hopefully that trend continues. I'm probably going to very much steal Ms. Mira's return on life reference. I love that, ROL. I think that's really what the focus has to be. What is bringing us a real return on life and a real return on a good quality life? Because most of these communities, they get stuck between very real street violence and very real over policing that's supposed to help the street violence, although it usually doesn't happen one for one. And what often happens is if these communities dare to even ask to not be over policed, they'll get under policing and they won't get any of the services that they are supposed to get. And that's not the reality that people want either. And we have to be honest about what happens and why it happens. And so when we talk about a holistic approach to things, one, I just always want to make sure we're clear. We have to talk about the safety and then the perception, because those are sometimes two different things. Sometimes people are safe, but don't perceive themselves to be safe. And even worse things can happen at that moment in time. But I think, you know, I come from the crazy left wing of the party, and I'm very proud of that. Used to be not a lot of voices like mine, but now there's a ton of them. And I'm happy to be here. Actually, and I know sometimes my colleague Adams is not as left of me, but she is definitely echoing many of the causes that we lift up, and I appreciate the work that she's always doing there. And we have a great panel here. But what I want to say is, I am also data driven. So I think one of the things we have to do better on the left is looking at this data and lifting up what's actually happening. So that doesn't happen very well. My hope is that begins to happen. We can't ignore the spikes in gun violence and the spikes in violent crime, which is, by the way, occurring across the nation. So we have to stop blaming things like New York State's bail reform for the rise in crime all over the nation. We have to look at this thing. But what I have put forth, and everybody most likely agrees, is this data sets travel the same. So the communities that have the high rates of homelessness, have the high rates of unemployment, have high rates of not being able to access quality health care, have high rates of maternal health issues. They are all the same places that you see these rises in crime and in certain violent crimes. And so what I submit and continue to submit is, if we address those issues, the data will actually go the same way. And so it's clear when you envision, what does a community that you think of as safe, what does that look like if you close your eyes? And I will say to you, most of the places you would think of do not have police on every corner. In fact, the ones that do, you probably don't deem them safe, even if they do have a police officer on every corner. And so that doesn't mean that officer doesn't have a job to do, but the safety looks like the communities that have all of the things and access to all of the things that we just described, and they do that without having a police officer on every corner. So yes, we have to look this holistically. And yes, we do have to look at data because we want the data to go in the right direction. But we have to be clear about what it is that we're looking at and how we're going to get that return on life. Because when we throw police at these communities, the return on life is not very good. And we have to be clear about that. And the quality of life is not very good. And I'm interested to hear, we probably won't hear it here, but I'm interested to hear more about what Mr. Michael's data usage is. We have some concern. I think data and digital and technology is important, but we have to be careful sometimes about what we do. Things like facial recognition, we've seen it trend the same biased ways that policing, not just policing, by the way, policing, education, health, all of those things, the unconscious bias that stays there, we've seen in some of the digital realm. So I just want to make sure that doesn't happen in some of the things that we're trying to push as well.
Ms. Adams?
I'm sitting here and I'm writing, and Jamani just, stole my thunder because, as Mr. Michael was speaking, the words that I wrote down, we've got the technology. Now, what do we do with it? Do we continue to see the data through the same lens that we've always seen it through? Do we continue to just bear through this information that we have and use it, in the skewed fashion that we've always had it used? And it is very skewed. I come from a technology background. I love data. I love, I love all of this. But my problem is, again, the way that it's been used, the way that it's been used against certain communities. We could cite a very specific case here in New York, but I won't do that, where information was used, and it was used in communities of color only for quote unquote DNA purposes. And it ended up rounding up, a number of Black men that I'm told is still who are traumatized this day to having their doors knocked on, by police, in order to get their DNA, whatever. So my whole thing again is, yes, we have the technology. It's amazing. It's remarkable. I don't think that it's transparent, though. I do think that people's privacy is invaded. I do believe that people's civil rights are trounced upon in some cases as well. So this information is fantastic. But the perspective of mine is, now we've got this amazing technology. The world over, but what are we doing with it? How are we using it to the best of our advantage to right the wrongs that have been done in our society? So, instead of a statement, Sarah, I've got, more of a question. We've got it. What are we going to do with it? We've got to do better.
Before I throw it to Mr. Michael for a response, I just want to ask Ms. Kavanaugh, what do you see as a more holistic measure of public safety in the city? And what do you think the city can do to achieve that more holistic metric?
So I think it is those community outcomes. The FENY EMS is the front line of healthcare, but it's not just about what happens when we respond. It's, what are the rates of heart disease in that community? What are the rates of obesity in that community? And how do we connect what we do to those long-term outcomes, right? Because that's really, we want to be part of the healthcare system that lifts people up, not just be part of the response. That's our first job, but we also want to be there to actually make sure our community is healthier. And I think sort of bringing it back to the data, because I'm assuming Mr. Michael is going next, is I think, part of my question would be for him as well. How does an agency like the fire department connect with those other data sources so that we can, put our outcomes and our operations in line with the larger healthcare system, the larger health of a community, to know that, we're playing an important role and we're playing a proactive role in that.
Mr. Michael, I'll turn to you, and then Ms. Mara, I'm sure you have something that you want to weigh in as well. Mr. Michael.
Great, thank you. First, I just want to put actually Ms. Adams and Mr. Williams and Ms. Ms. Kavanaugh didn't bring it up, but for Ms. Adams and Mr. Williams, Celebrite's technology isn't, and I it's hard using the term digital intelligence because everybody automatically thinks in terms like surveillance and facial recognition, things like that. That's not what our technology is about at all. We're taking, and I've been involved in law enforcement outside of Celebrite in some probably controversial facial recognition projects, not me directly, but as a result of them being used. And there's none of that at use. When we talk about the digital intelligence solution specifically for law enforcement, specifically for Celebrite, it's taking data that's already available and combining it. It's still reviewed by a person. There's no automated process. And I think from my standpoint, from doing 12 years of these investigations, I've been involved in everything from overseas terrorism investigations, the Boston bombing investigations, to local stolen car investigations. It is important to keep the human in that. It's taking those data sources and it's not giving me the answer. I still have to find the answer. It's just giving me an easier way to find it. I definitely wouldn't trust. I don't want to say, let me rephrase that. I don't want to say not trust, but I wouldn't take an automated response that the computer gave me without review, especially we're talking about somebody's potential freedom. The last thing we ever want to do, or the last thing we, or especially me, ever want to do is have somebody, that's a person of interest or a suspect that didn't deserve to be, or wasn't, I say deserve, but wasn't. There wasn't a reason to suspect them. So for the facial recognition part and the the whole surveillance part, none of that's part of the solutions. This is taking data that's already available and cutting down on the review time for it. Cellebrite's big goal and mission when it comes to digital intelligence is to make it easier for the analyst, the investigator to locate the relevant data, and definitely not, we definitely don't want to cut that process out. As for Ms. Kavanaugh specifically, as far as getting that data, how does it apply to public safety as a whole? Currently, probably not a lot, but I know one of the big goals in the future is to get that data combined with other statistical sources, not just within the criminal justice community and law enforcement community, but looking at areas, where we see, not even the most crime, but we see the most resources are needed. Again, it's still reviewed by a human, but this way you can plan your response times, where to put your resources, where there are people in need, where we have the most mental health crises. I can tell you still from 10 years ago, I remember probably the same 5 houses I used to go to, at least multiple times a year, where, there was somebody there in distress. Those, they don't have an opportunity because there's nowhere for them to go to move on. So they're at home. And this, the digital intelligence solutions help you identify those so you can have those resources available to respond. And Ms. Adams and Mr. Williams, I hope I put your mind at ease, at least for some of it.
So I guess basically the question becomes, how does the city responsibly use these giant data sources to pursue sort of human-based solutions, like human-centric solutions? And Ms. Mera, if you want to quickly take that, we have about 10 minutes left in this panel. So I have one last question I'd like to ask everyone after we hear from Ms. Mera.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So, while the conversation is about data and data as an asset, I think what everyone has shared really sums up to education. We need to be educating every New Yorker and every stakeholder to ensure that the data assets and technologies that are available today and that are going to be developed for tomorrow are being used fairly and equitably. I'm reminded of the time when the internet was born. It was viewed both as a blessing and a curse. I think the same is true for the data assets and the technologies we have today. It's really upon us to educate everyone to have a better understanding and appreciation for how, when, why, and where we use the data that's available to us.
So I'm going to bring this down to my final question. We began this conversation starting to talk about public safety in the context of equity and racially sort of equal outcomes, because I think we can all agree that Black and Brown people disproportionately have had worse health outcomes, have had worse interactions with the police. There's no debating that. The mayor has created a racial justice commission that will propose solutions in December that will be on the November 2022 ballot. So that's going to be looking at structural changes in the city charter. And that's something that's going to be the city charter of the city's constitution. So from each of you, any of you, I'd like to hear what structural solutions, what changes would you like to see to the city charter that could make the city safer in perpetuity, arguably. Mr. Williams, I'll let you go first.
That's a great question. Shout out, there's a few commissioners there that I think are about it. So I want to, shout out Kay Bain, Mr. Louis Favors, Joanne Yu. I know they're going to do awesome work and make sure that we're in the right direction. I did want to say to Mr. Michael, I don't know if all the concerns are assuaged, but I appreciate you starting to talk about what it is. I definitely would like to, hear some more information. I would say I'm looking forward to what they come up with. In terms of the charter of powers, I'd love to see more balance just in general between the powers of the council and the mayor, just generally speaking. I think no matter who the mayor is, there's too much of this is the strongest mayoralty in the entire country. And so that makes it difficult. A lot of times folks are looking at the council to do things that they actually can't do. One of the things that I would love to see is that there are certain commissioners and chancellors that I believe the city council should have advice and consent on. One of them is the commissioner at least, and the other is the chancellor of education. So I'd love to, sorry?
You mean the police commissioner, right?
Yeah, Commissioner NYPD and the Chancellor of Department of Education. There's a bunch of other charter things that I think could change that I'd love to see happen. But I think it's important that we look at all of the institutions. And one of the things that I've always had an issue with is when we talk about public safety, we talk about the abuses, it's the hyper focus on the police. And I understand why, because when it happens quickly. But some of these institutions are killing the same people. They're just doing it a lot slower. And I would like to see the same kind of vigilance in the education department, in the health department, so that we can see and uplift the same kind of tragedies that are happening there time and time again. As a matter of fact, those are the tragedies that we're often sending the police department in to solve, that they don't have the ability to solve. And as Mr. Michaels has put out, if you talk to some of these police officers, there are many of these calls that they don't want to be going on because they don't have the tools to actually solve it. So in a lot of these things, we're actually on the same page. I also want to say we talk about police again, and I've often said we're not even looking at the tools that we have. And so we have a department that has 35,000 police officers. People are saying we need more. They haven't even discussed about where those officers are being deployed. Are they in the subways looking to see who hopped the fare? Or are they walking around in the trains to see what's happening? And so these are the type of discussions that I'm hoping the next administration will help lead. It's harder to have this discussion. So because most folks who think they disagree with me, when we actually sit down and have a discussion, we're much more aligned. But it is easier to feed the fares of public safety because the rewards are usually quicker and faster. But what we need is leadership that will help parse through what people are feeling. People want to feel safe and they want to be safe. And we need to walk them through what does that actually mean? And what does all of the knowledge that we have lead us to say actually works? And it's easy to say, I'm going to send more police to your community because we're trained to do that. And we're trained to believe that that is what causes the relief. But when we look at it, it's actually by itself not. And we know that. We know that for certain communities. But for others, we really don't take the time to really explain why this can't be the sole solution that we push forward. And that takes leadership. And I'm hoping that that's the leadership we see in the coming administrations. And finally, the city, the state, and the federal government may be aligned, particularly on gun violence. And I'm looking forward to be a part of that discussion. People on this panel, especially the public safety chair, Ms. Adams.
Ms. Adams, what charter changes do you think could make New York City safer in the long run?
You know, I love it when we speak about this particular commission. I actually eavesdropped on their last meeting, which happened to they had yesterday evening. So I'm really I'm in awe of the talent that all of them bring to the commission, but they definitely have their work cut out for them. You know, when it comes to this particular issue and yet another, charter mandate. So, Jamani said everything perfectly, eloquent. I'll just take this discussion just a certain way that we don't necessarily look at public safety. For me, in looking at particularly my district, language access is a public safety issue for us here. When we take a look at the fact that in 2021, New York City does not honor the languages that are spoken here. We are a city of immigrants. And New York City does not honor the number of languages that are spoken in this city down to the city council level, where we cannot even have interpretation in our hearings to accommodate the witnesses that are there in oversight with us. That's a problem for me as public safety chair. So I've seen, over the past 6 months that I've, had oversight over public safety, for me, being the committee chair and having to hear testimony for different areas of this city, and there is a distinct language barrier. We have no interpretation services on the council level to handle that. I asked about it once and I was told that when we had it last in budget hearing for last year, it costs a lot of money for the city council to do this. And I'm going, it costs a lot of money. This should be automatic here. and I sound like, like I don't even know, but I'm going, this is New York. What are we talking about? We don't do this. So for me, in looking at this particular commission right now, they need to have serious discussions around the issue of language access as it pertains to public safety. So that would be my throw into that.
We have just about 3 minutes left. Ms. Kavanaugh, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I think I will just echo, what the public advocate and the council member said. And to keep it short, I think I would also just ask the commission look at pay and equity within the agencies as well. I think when you're talking about pay and equity in the community, how can you have that if you don't have that in the agencies? And I think they both probably know what I'm referring to. So I would definitely ask that, when you're talking about structural change, that structural change has to be economic. And so I hope that they look at that as an issue.
I think we should just say EMS. I'll say it if you can't say it.
Thank you, sir.
Say it out loud.
Ms. Michael, Ms. Mara, anything you want to add here? And what's a good structural change you could see in the city charter that would improve public safety?
Yeah, thanks, Summer, and thank you, everyone. If I may, this pandemic and what this pandemic has taught us, I'm reminded of the line from To a Mouse by Robert Burns. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Thus, resiliency and equitable access to information and insights on any device, speaking to us in any language, becomes valuable and allows us to remain focused on ROL.
Right.
Thank you.
Ms. Michael?
It was so not on as far as the changes to the city charter. I would love to see New York thrive again. Back, I mean, even 2.5, 3 years ago, the last time I was there, even where we were then. I believe it's always hard. I don't want to say hard, but it could sometimes be a challenging coming from a law enforcement background. But I agree with Ms. Adams and Mr. Williams and Ms. Kavanaugh as well. Everything, we need to focus on the resources available for public safety as a whole. I really think when it comes to city charter, the reallocation of resources and getting people into their specific job roles is really what needs to be done. Let the police, based upon fighting crime, deal with violent crime, and definitely have resources out there for mental health, both on scene and then even the next steps. Because I know I said it once, but I'll repeat it again, especially when it comes to mental health and issues like homelessness, there's only so far we can go. And then we run out of resources. I don't mean money, resources, like physical resources of what to do next. I mean, I can hand it on to someone who works for Ms. Kavanaugh, and then they take it and they hand it on as far as they go. And then what? There's a definitive stopping line that really shouldn't be there.
I guess I believe that's the end of our time. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. I think it's been a pretty interesting conversation. And I'm hoping that we'll hear more about structural change to public safety in the next coming year. And then of course, once this Racial Justice Commission issues its proposals, there will be a whole year of debate before these questions end up on the ballot. So I'm sure we'll be debating this for the years to come. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Zach.
you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Summer, for moderating such a great discussion. And thank you to all of our panelists. And as he said, this conversation is not ending anytime soon. It's going to be going forward. And luckily, we got Summer, who's one of the experts in the city on charter revisions. That's for sure. So before we get into our third and final discussion of the day, I do got to acknowledge once again our wonderful sponsors that helped us put on this event and all the great speakers that you've heard thus far. They include CDW, Berkeley College, Celebrite, Data Miner, Carter, Ledyard, and Milborn, Corelight, Splunk, and SWAC. That's a Secure Worker Access Consortium. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much for helping us put on this event. Now, without further ado, it's our third and final discussion of the day. and my opportunity to drop one of my favorite buzzwords of the 21st century, digital hygiene. This panel will focus on keeping New York's information safe. Moderating this discussion is a real expert in this field, Kristen Malik, Director of Business Diversity at CDW. Oh, ready when you are, Kristen. For some reason, we can't hear you though. Are you on mute or something? Uh-oh, looks like we got a little bit of technical difficulties on her side. We'll just wait until she jumps in. Could be a microphone thing. Maybe she's got an AirPod handy, perhaps. Uh-oh. Well, I'll just filibuster a little bit here. You know, if you really want to keep up on issues like this, make sure to go to cityandstateny.com and subscribe to our First Read newsletter, which will give you all the updates you need to keep up with everything going on with public safety in New York City, as well as just city politics in general. And of course, Albany Agenda is a newsletter that I, Zach Williams, senior state politics reporter at City and State, composes every week, comes out Monday afternoons, help you know everything that's going on in Albany, which of course has a huge influence on New York City policy. Oh, how are we doing? It looks like Kristen has dropped out and will be coming back in shortly. Maybe I will just make an executive decision here to maybe just have each of the panelists introduce themselves very briefly, just say a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you fit into this discussion about keeping New York's information safe. Maybe we could start with Wolf Moser.
Sure, hi. Wolf Moser, I'm one of the a supervisor in the cyber branch of the New York office of the FBI. And I work one of the squads who's working in a task force environment to investigate cybercrime.
Excellent. And how's the sound over on your side, Christian? Oh, can you hear me? Uh-oh, she dropped out. Maybe we could have Ms. Baptiste tell a little bit about herself.
Sure. Good afternoon, and I apologize for the noise in the background. Someone has decided to cut steel outside of my window. But there's New York City for you. So my name is Yvonne Baptiste. I am an AVP at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, essentially the city's economic development arm. We are focused at the moment on increasing the workforce participation in cybersecurity. So I am part of the Cyber NYC team, which is our cybersecurity ecosystem development initiative.
Let's give one more sound check to Kristen over there. Can you hear us?
Hi.
Can we hear you?
Hi, good afternoon.
There we go. I'll sign off from here then.
Thank you so much for filling in, and my apologies. I don't know, but you never know, right? That's what we're going to talk through today. So I don't want to interrupt the flow of our distinguished panelists, but just a warm thank you to City and State for hosting this panel. The entire summit has been one of reckoning of learning, and I think you can't learn unless you listen. And so if there's anything that I'm grateful for in this virtual environment is that there are so many opportunities to learn, right? The information is at our fingertips. And so today the panel is, well prepared, complete breadth of SME that they're going to share, on cybersecurity and keeping us all safe in our new environment. So I'll let the flow continue for intros, but thanks for the sound check here. So Justin, do we want to go to you?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Kristen. Justin McDonald, I'm the Executive Security Strategist here at CDW. I've got over 25 years experience of IT&S experience, and then have spent over the past decade in the InfoSec and cybersecurity world. And I've been privileged enough to work with some of the best cyber experts from the FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security. And I recently came over from one of the largest global digital forensics and incident response firms, where I personally worked hundreds of ransomware cases. So pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Justin. All right, Colin.
Hi, I'm Colin Ahern. I'm the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York. I help to lead an organization called New York City Cyber Command, which prevents, detects, responds, and recovers from cyber threats against city systems, and provides tools so that residents, visitors, and businesses can lead safer lives online. I'm also an adjunct associate professor at the Columbia School of International Public Affairs, where I specialize in cybersecurity technology and cyber resilience.
Thanks, Colin, for being here. I'm glad you brought up your experience as a professor. I think there's just such an opportunity to continue to teach. So that's not easy to have a job and then take a second professor job as well for bandwidth. But I was so glad you brought that up in your bio. I was thankful for that. Okay, and sorry, I did miss who went first. I think we have Jack and Alex to go, unless they already went. Jack, did you want to go? I'm pulling a Kristen, if you want to come off mute.
My name is Jack Graham. I'm a partner at Carter, Ledyard & Milburn, where I lead a team of lawyers to provide advice on the legal requirements around cybersecurity and data privacy. There are a patchwork of laws that apply in this area, and we help clients in individuals, companies, public sector, figure out what applies, what they need to do in order to comply with the law, and to think about the laws that are coming down the pike, and how they can avoid having to do rush work in the future in order to comply with the laws we know are coming. I'm really glad to be part of this panel and honored to be among this group.
Well, thanks, Jack. I think it's always better when we're prepared too, or at least have an effort of preparedness instead of being reactive. So thanks for your contributions. Looking forward to the conversation. And I believe we'll round it out with Alex.
All right, thank you. My name is Alex Kirk. I have spent the last 17 years as a commercial open source security specialist, working first as a researcher with SourceFire, doing intrusion detection, writing malware signatures, that sort of thing. And then following on with time as a field implementation engineer at Cisco and Tenable prior to the couple of years that I've spent now here at Corelight as our global principal engineer. So I'm really here to represent the technology side of the house.
Good to have you here, and Justin and I, our teammates at CDW. So thank you for your partnership, as well in this space. So before we, hop into it, I think, I don't think I've had a conversation this year where someone hasn't ended, be safe, be well, right? Or that's kind of how we've all gone off of Zoom or if we've met in person on a coffee of be well. So I think as we look at today's panel, we think, the threat is particularly acute, in a global economic hub, just like New York City, where we are today. And so with trillions of dollars, financial assets, more multi-billion-dollar media companies than any other, so many small businesses at high risk. We know that there is such a potential for cyber attacks and cyber incursions. And so that's what we're really going to dive into today, looking at the economy in New York City. But I just, when I was preparing for this and reading about all of you, it's like, no one, I have literally not had a conversation where they haven't said be safe. So how do we be safe in this new environment, right? We are now digitized more than ever. And what does, the next 6 months look like? I think we're still writing that chapter for sure, but I know everyone, listening and who tuning in, is eager to hear, how do we stay safe collectively? How do we keep our assets safe? How do we keep our finances safe? How do we keep, organizations safe as well? And so, we'll lean into that today. So Jack, I thought I would, start with you. I wanted to see if you would be able to share what are some of the legal consequences, excuse me, of, when a hacker does access, when we aren't in that position of safety, when they are able to access personal or confidential information and it becomes that dark web? I can say, that dark web is kind of a anomaly to me, but what does that look like? What's your experience, and what would you share as any legal developments coming in the pipeline for New York as we approach this?
Well, Kristen, thanks. That's a great question that hits on a lot of the key legal issues that affect this space. I mean, probably the number one issue that everyone turns to when there is a breach is the requirement, and this is one of the few legal requirements that exists, to notify the people affected. We all are used to shopping and interacting with all sorts of companies, including government agencies, and we have to provide a lot of personal information in order to get services. We click through privacy policies without thinking about it, and while in theory you can have a claim for breach of those policies, really what the companies are required to do is notify you. This applies also to government agencies as well, and that notification has to be prompt, it has to be complete, and it has to be within a reasonable period of time, unless there's an ongoing criminal investigation or a law enforcement investigation. So it's often because of these laws that we even hear about breaches, because of this requirement that affected individuals be notified. The second area of legal requirements I think that people should think about is in the cyber area, particularly for financial institutions, insurance companies, banks. There are legal requirements and regimens that require these companies to take reasonable steps in order to protect information against expected attacks. Now, because the law is not good and shouldn't be too specific because technology is always changing, these laws are phrased in terms of what's reasonable, what can be expected, and they're really requiring companies to set up systems and processes to create a CISO function and then empower that person. I serve as a CISO for my law firm, for example, and it's really important that we, every organization, think hard about whether they have actually taken steps to set up processes and procedures and then educate people on them. The law does require all of us to do that. Looking forward, New York State is considering enacting a comprehensive privacy regimen that would create much stricter requirements for getting opt-in to use and share information, much stricter requirements on disclosures to what's done with personal information, along the lines of what states like California, Virginia, Colorado, and the European Union have done. And so when I'm counseling clients about this, really my headline is, don't read the law and think about what you need to do today. Read what is happening in the news and read what other jurisdictions are doing, and imagine what your company should be doing in 5 years when you live in a world where people really have more of a property interest in their own personal data. And how are you going to honor the rights that your consumers and customers have in that data by giving them the right to change it, to access it, and to know what you've done with it? Kristen, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. I would probably say, now I'm like hypersensitive around it. I would probably say that I, for one, am a click-througher. Like you said, we click through the things to move to the next page. And so I wrote that down. But I loved what you said of how do we treat our personal data like personal property. That will stick with me for a while. So thanks for that comment and walking through what's ahead and what consequences could look like. Thank you. So Justin, I wanted to see if we could turn to you as we look through, move from some legality, and consequential things to what can you say have been some of the learnings you've had about just the overall threat landscape, right? Before we even get to legality, I guess, what does that landscape look like? What are some best practices we can do to do that just be safe, like we kind of talked through?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kristen. One of the things, we all know that ransomware continues to grow every day. The ransomware payments are increasing dramatically as well. And someone I saw in one of the chats about working remotely since the pandemic, that has been, really a field day for threat actors, because, two things is, one, the perimeter has changed. Instead of just protecting your fortress, you now have a remote workforce that's working remotely with, no security tools or very limited security tools. And so, in all, like many of my cases, last couple of years, a lot of the targets have been states, municipalities, and also school districts. So I've worked a ton of those over the past few years, along with healthcare. But the threat actors, some of these are billion-dollar organizations. They make it easy and accessible for people to go out and buy ransomware kits for low prices. And, one of the things that, working with organizations is, a lot of time they're like, we didn't think we'd be the next target. We're only a $50 million business. And, I can tell you, it doesn't matter what size you are, enterprise to SMB space, everyone's, could be a potential victim. The other thing is, incident response plans, organizations that, think they have really good incident response plans. Some organizations don't have incident response plans. And I talked to one organization the other day that said that they stored their IR plan on their SharePoint, which, if the network's down, they're not going to have access to any of the contacts that they really need to get involved with. And they also didn't realize this, the real impact it had on the business. We look at ransomware cases, the average is organizations are down to 10 to 12 days. What impact does that have on their business? And, how I kind of look at it is, obviously products and services are great. There's no silver bullet. We all know that. But I look at it as, organizations really should be focused on, more of a security strategy, an overall strategy for all business units to buy in on and to work towards and building out that overall strategy. The second thing is, security as a culture, is really developing and implementing that as a culture to, not only education and cybersecurity awareness training for employees, but get employees to be able to, what's most important to them is their children, their families, and getting them to actually implement those security measures at home, so then they translate that back to the workspace. So that's really important. I had a meeting with the FBI a few weeks ago, and one of the big points that they said is, patch management and OS upgrades needs to be done immediately. I know that's hard for a lot of IT organizations to implement that quick, but they said that's a huge risk. Risk management, asset management, identity and access management as well. Admin rights, kind of mapping out from an organization who has access to critical controls, who has access to critical systems or finance or any of those things, and do they need them? If I'm Bob, an engineer, do I need to have access to those? Application whitelisting, but one of the critical ones is backups and being able to recover from backup. And that's one of the big ones, because if you can recover from backup during a ransomware, that's going to put you in a very good situation not to have to negotiate with the terrorist. Network segmentation, and the last one I'll kind of stop with is MFA, multi-factor authentication, especially from a remote workforce. I think that needs to happen. But, during my experience, I've seen from all the different malware that's being launched every day, but over the past 2 years, it seems to be a lot of TrickBot, Ryuk, Emotet, Botnet, and then some of the healthcare cases I've worked, that's Maze, which is more of a credential hunting, to where they're pulling PHI information and holding that as ransom. So, I just think going back is, yes, it's great to have great products and technologies, as we've seen on the news. It's not going to, keep you safe. It's more of the policy, procedures, and the overall security strategy.
Thanks, Justin. I took a few notes. I loved that you said security is a culture. I think we've also had, conversations so much about diversity, inclusion, and DEI and workforce, and shouldn't be a response to a crisis, but a culture, right? And so it just made me think of that when you said security is a culture. I also wrote down personally when you said, what does security look like at home, right? And how does that translate to the workforce? Because I have a 10 and 12-year-old TikToking, so I don't know I'll have to look at our security. I don't know I got to look at that. I will do that tonight. I wrote it down. But yeah, what does it look like at home, and how do you translate, to the workforce? And so I did have one clarifying question, or if anyone wants to jump in on, Justin, you talked about, the IR plan. Are you suggesting maybe have an IR plan, or should that be replaced with a security strategy, or good to have both? And of course, welcome, anyone from the panel too, but go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely have both. And I recommend, not only having an IR plan, but actually running through a tabletop exercise. And again, that should include all stakeholders. That should include outside counsel. That should include your PR firm. That should include your partners, your executive teams. It should include all business stakeholders that, when something happens. So I recommend that everyone prints out their IR plan and with the contacts of all those different organizations and partners, and actually keep a copy at home and keep a copy at work.
Thanks for the clarity. Alex, did you want to jump in here?
Sorry, one thing that I wanted to say to that is that a security policy and set of procedures really does align well with a good IR plan. Because fundamentally, when you're doing incident response, you're going to need to rely on a set of processes that were in place before that incident occurred. And some of the very fundamental things that we think about from an IR perspective are things that are somewhat neglected by the industry still. Asset management and visibility is kind of a key point in a lot of organizations that they're scanning things actively once every 30 days and maybe mishmashing some endpoint data into a SIM and getting 50 to 75% coverage of their assets at best. And if you don't realize that somebody has plugged in a home VPN concentrator to the network to enable some sort of a remote work scenario, then you don't realize that that is a vector for exploitation by ransomware actors that they can drop into your network and go with. And that problem is becoming particularly acute as we distribute throughout the cloud and remote workforce and all the modern trends that are out there. And while I don't think that anyone necessarily, again, has that silver bullet for getting asset visibility across all of those places, that sort of strategy and having as much telemetry as you can have about what is taking place between these assets, what kind of software is on them, what they're vulnerable to, et cetera, is all going to be very informative when you do discover that incident and you're able to kind of go back and deconstruct how somebody got in, what actually occurred once they got in. To Jack's point about disclosure, if you don't understand the scope of what actually occurred during an incident because you lacked that fundamental visibility into your network to start with, you're going to have a real hard time complying with requests for disclosure. And so really all these things are wrapped up into a broader process. And to the point of think about where you need to be in 5 years, I think that's been a big problem that the industry has had. There's been a lot of reactionary sort of, I got to go purchase this point product right now because of a gap that's been identified by, an incident or a tabletop exercise or whatever. And there's less coherent strategic planning about capability sets and interaction between all of these different data sets and vendor technologies to bring a coherent process to bear against security.
Kristen, if I can just build on that with a small, but I think important legal point. I mean, the time and attention and resources that an organization puts into doing tabletop exercises and drafting real meaningful incident response plans and security protocols is very important if there is a later breach that happens notwithstanding all the planning. Because if a stakeholder, an investor, a consumer brings a lawsuit because of damages, and this happens with almost every major breach, the fact that the organization did take these steps and did take reasonable steps to avoid having these things happen is a very important part of the defense of any action.
Thank you both for adding. I definitely took down some notes of things to look at. You know, there's so much legality and what's at risk and what's at stake. I wanted to see, Colin, if we could turn a little bit on, you know, the critical work you do for the city, but the economic mobilization that your organization is working to. You know, when I was looking at your organization, something that just really stood out is, you know, by implementing strategies, you know, for Cyber NYC, we aim to spur the creation of 10,000 cybersecurity jobs. You know, we're looking for all stakeholders, workforce, you know, through $100 million suite of public-private investments. You know, I think where we are today in 2021 and where we want to go, we want to see economic mobilization. We want planes taking off again, school buses coming through the road. I know I do want that school bus to show up. We want things to start happening again. So could you just walk through some of the economic improvements and about the important work you're doing?
Yeah, and before I kick it over to EDC, a couple of things to mention. One is that high-performing teams are diverse teams, and high-performing teams are teams with a lot of psychological safety. So it's cybersecurity is a team sport, and it's one that an individual contributor, a line one SOC tier one analyst at 3 a.m. is going to be the one that's either going to feel like they can bring a problem, wake up the boss, and prevent a bad event from being a very bad event, or not. So DEI and respecting each other and the organization's culture are fundamental to security outcomes. So kind of mentioning that at the top, I think, is important. Two of the things we've done, obviously, in close collaboration with EDC, who I think should speak right after this, and actually NYU and several other stakeholders, is a talent pipeline for the city. The unemployment rate in cybersecurity is essentially zero. There's a huge deficit of cybersecurity talent all over the world and not just in New York City. So we're building relationships with academia, with the City University of New York, with the top tier research universities within the 5 boroughs, Cornell, Technion, NYU, et cetera. And we think that non-traditional hires are going to be an increasingly important part of the cybersecurity workforce. And so we're doing things like the Cyber Strike Challenge with NYU, where we bring in people on nights and weekends to work on the city's cyber range and other things like that. And I think maybe Zevion probably should just talk about some of the incredibly important things her team is doing as well.
Sure, not a problem. Thanks, Colin. No, I agree with everything that Colin just said. With Cyber NYC, it's an incredibly timely focus on cybersecurity, but it originated actually before the pandemic. So around 2018 as part of the mayor's push for creating 100,000 jobs in emerging industries across the city, everything from not just cybersecurity, but everything including AI, blockchain, media and entertainment, fashion, VR, the goal being to look at industries that not only are in really challenging, interesting sectors, but also would allow for economic growth for New Yorkers. In the case of Cyber NYC, the program was created as a way of supporting the growth of the ecosystem as a whole in New York City, but with the understanding that as the ecosystem grew, it would be ideal if it actually reflected the diversity of New York City. As we are all aware, and frankly, as this panel somewhat reflects, cybersecurity is very much a white male area with, I think the latest numbers are 14% female participation, 3% African American. So the question being, how does the city engage and ensure that as the, I believe, 30,000 unfilled jobs in the New York City metropolitan area are trained for, how do you make sure that a broad swath of New Yorkers are engaged in that promise? So programmatically, the way we approached it was twofold. One, looking at the demand side for labor, trying to work with partners, for example, Jerusalem Venture Partners, on our growth stage accelerator, which had its cohort last year virtual due to the pandemic, as well as engaging with SOSA out of Israel to put on programming that would not only foster talent by connecting entrepreneurs in the cybersecurity space with mentorship, but to also have programming for the general public to make them more aware of opportunities in cybersecurity. This was sort of, broad-ranging programs for folks who had no idea what cybersecurity was, to, for example, jobs fairs with our academic partners like CUNY, LaGuardia in particular. So that's, and then of course, as Colin mentioned previously, our academic partnerships with trying to create more of a tighter touch point between the academic side, in this case, partners from Columbia, NYU, and CUNY, those university affiliates, and then bring research into a commercialized space with the support of the city through a early stage accelerator. On the supply side for our workforce, we looked at, we tried to answer the question of how is it that you can engage folks no matter where they are in terms of their understanding of cybersecurity. So whether you have a high school degree or whether you are an IT professional, or in one case, an Uber driver, or somebody who is mid-career and looking for a change. And so we had several programs, for example, the stackable credentialing program with NYU that would allow current professionals to switch over and really just gain skills and expertise that met them where they are. And at present, our more sort of like entry-level focus on our partnership with Full Stack Cybersecurity, Full Stack Academy, standing up the cybersecurity boot camp. That particular project graduated about 103 New Yorkers. And the city, as a result of COVID-19, announced an additional partnership that is currently funding some 29 students. So long as they have a high school diploma, can show that they are in need of financial assistance to engage in the boot camp and have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. The city has decided to fund the entirety of the $17,000 tuition for them to attend the boot camp, which is effectively a 17-week program on the full-time side, 26 weeks on the part-time side. And at the end of it, these folks will be certified to engage in the work of security operations center analysts, as well as penetration testers. So that's basically where we are. I think the overall thought that we have, the overall philosophy is really that if the pandemic has shown anything, besides how vulnerable everyone is as we migrate our social, economic, and every other aspect of our lives online, how vulnerable all of that is to cybersecurity. The question is, how can we frame engagement in cybersecurity as not only a fantastic job prospect, but an act of service, and something that will help New Yorkers as a whole, and really just the industry to develop in a more sustainable and diverse way.
I am so overwhelmed with all of your stats of just what a booming, successful program. I would just say congratulations to both of you. And you can tell the collaboration where you were leaning into each other. That's such good role modeling. And 103 at full tuition. I can see like Justin, Jack, Alex smiling because they're like, okay, that's a talent pipeline. CDW is hiring, partners are hiring, right? We are looking for the next best. But thank you for continuing education. and investing in that and seeing that through. Yeah, I'm grateful, for that work, and I think well said in active service. So, so thank you for that, both of you. I think I love when these aren't planned this way, but on an active service, I feel compelled to talk to Wolf of the FBI, and just always a huge gratitude for your work and your organization. But Wolf, I would welcome you in to share your perspective on what you've heard today, but then also kind of in my research, I was looking at the National Cybersecurity Summit, and some comments there that we have to change the cost benefit calculus of criminals and national states who believe they can compromise U.S. networks. And I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on what you're seeing in your lens today, tomorrow, in the future.
Sure, thank you. I think, really, I would reflect a couple of things that have already really been mentioned by the panelists, both in this panel and previously earlier this afternoon. I guess, focusing the two words that come to mind, really, culture and education, are the ones that have been mentioned already. So by culture, I think we really have to adapt within the culture of law enforcement to address cyber threats. And law enforcement tends to be resistant sometimes to that kind of immediate change. So it needs to be pushed, but we need to change the culture, and I think take some lessons. And it's already certainly happening. I think lessons that have been learned from earlier major disasters, as earlier panelists mentioned about, such as 9/11, that cyber investigations have to be worked in a joint manner. You can't have basically different agencies all pursuing separate investigations. So one thing that we have done, particularly in New York, is brought together, local, state, and federal law enforcement all at the New York field office of the FBI to work in a task force environment. And I think that is going to be a bigger trend, with more and more people kind of joining, hopefully more agencies joining. Obviously, the more that join, the better. And having that local presence, obviously New York, this is one of probably the most important task force in the country. Just the fact that we're able to communicate with city agencies directly when there's a threat to one of their networks just makes a huge change in being able to not necessarily get ahead of an intrusion, but to address it and assess it in a much faster manner. I think, like I said, that education is key, and it's been mentioned in various different ways earlier. I mean, obviously there are great steps like was described with Zevian earlier, actual education programs. I think the FBI can really help to kind of use its investigations to better educate people and companies, enterprises about the attacks that they're facing, as opposed to, simply investigating to try to find the culprits, which is still obviously one of our objectives. Investigating the way the attacks work and the types of vulnerabilities that are being targeted, and then communicating that information back to the public is part of that education that I think is pretty critical. Just a final point, I would add that I don't have any specific numbers, but I think that the lack of female representation was brought up, and I can attest that in the New York office, we're acutely aware that that's a problem. We're aware of it. The representation is much lower than, for example, if you look at the percentage even of FBI agents, the male to female ratio is somewhat lower than the population to begin with. When you look at cybersecurity, it's even lower than the actual ratio within the FBI itself. So it's something that we are definitely aware of and we need to address. I thought that was an interesting point that was brought up. That's all.
Thanks for all of that. I again took. You're right. It's culture, it's workforce, it's working together, collaborating. I really appreciate you saying the more local we can get involved, the more awareness, just a true invitation to collaborate, right? Like silos are down, and how do we work together? That's what, I really felt. And you're right, it's not every day on a live panel we create our own use case for diversity and what it looks like. But thank you for acknowledging that. And I think all of us can probably just be part of, a promise of progress going forward, right? And that's what we can do. So, okay, so not getting too heavy, but moving on to, Alex, your Corelight is just incredible platform to ensure, the things that we've heard about keeping personal data safe and breaches and having IR plans. If you could walk us through, what are platforms to give us the best sense of that, be safe? What are you seeing out there? What are the deployments your team is leaning into, levering on? We just really love, for you to round us out on what we can do better and what you see.
Certainly. And one thing that I would speak to before the issue of tools and technologies is going back to process a bit. One of the silos that we see all too commonly out in the wild is between network teams and security teams within organizations. The former having a focus on uptime and availability, and the latter being the kings of no, so to speak, and the ones who come in and break things in the sake of security. And really, I think that we need to be breaking down those walls as well organizationally to ensure that all departments within any given enterprise are aligned. And it speaks well to recognition of that fact that we're getting more alignment between government entities. The fact that the NSA actually just dropped an advisory on Chinese state-sponsored attacks and the techniques and methodologies being used in them on Tuesday is just more progress in us all coming together as defenders, towards a common mission. But in terms of the technology landscape and how we can do better as an industry, I think we've all kind of reached a point where we can agree on the SOC triad as a concept, where you need endpoint data and network data, then centralized in some sort of analytics platform where you can bring in threat intelligence, indicators of compromise, all those other things to take all the data that may come from your disparate systems and make actual knowledge and intelligence out of it. And the one trend that I think is going to really help a lot of organizations is towards consolidation of what they're bringing into that base of knowledge. Because too many organizations have, got dozens potentially of different point products within a security stack. Everyone has kind of gone with the defense in depth mentality of, if this one detection technology doesn't find it, this one or this one or this one falling behind it might. And fundamentally, I think as an industry, we need to shift towards fewer but higher quality data sources as we're informing our understanding of our environments, doing detections within them, being able to baseline for anomalies. Because the less time that we're spending getting our tools to interoperate with each other, to adhere to open standards, to bring the tech together in the same way that we're bringing the people together, the better the chance that we can actually streamline a process that works in the vendor technologies that we've got in support of the organizational objectives that are going to make us secure at the end of the day.
Thank you. I really have always appreciated, and probably now more so, the leaning into quality over quantity. And so, thank you for bringing that, to the force. That I think we have 2 questions in the chat, but I just wanted to thank, all of you personally, and for everyone listening. I think as I look back at my takeaways, I have a whole page here of, of treating our personal data like we do our personal property, Jack. That's like really hit home for me of, am I protecting the same way? And taking measures. Psychological safety, right, is one that in all of this and that we're talking through, and how, whether you're experienced or new to this field or segment, that has to be at the forefront for all of us today, to bring our best selves, to the work. I love acts of service. I've leaned into that a lot. Security, it has to be a culture, and then, quality, over quantity is really where we find ourselves today. So I just want to thank you for that. I think we have just a few minutes, and I will open this up. We have a question from a listener today. Are most cyber attacks a result of lone actors, organizations, or are they state-sponsored attacks? And I can feel free to come on mute. These are live questions. You want to take a stab at it?
So at the risk of hogging the spotlight here, I would say that it's a lot less lone actors today than it is organized activity. And while there's certainly a great deal of state-sponsored activity, again, leaning back to that NSA disclosure from earlier this week, there's a great deal of organized criminal enterprise as well. A lot of the folks out there who are able to go buy a ransomware kit off the shelf and get 24/7 support to then go drop it on their victims, they wouldn't be able to do that without that system behind them that does all of the coding and the infrastructure delivery that's necessary to evade modern detections. So I think it's our adversaries are getting more organized, and that's why we as defenders need to do the same.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in, or next question?
Yeah, I think organized crime is probably, from a numbers perspective, a good reference point is a document called the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which is a widely read industry publication. And I think, if my talking points serve me well, 80% or so of reported breaches, so we're dealing with a known and not an unknown, are organized crime, with state affiliated being something less than 5% of reported breaches. But you might describe that also the sophistication of state actors and their ability to not be detected. But it seems clear even from the data we do have that organized crime is far and away the most prevalent threat to individuals and businesses and governments.
Thank you. Thank you for the reference point of the report. Our viewers will definitely be able to take that as a tangible takeaway. Okay, in our 60 seconds, maybe we can all go around. Wolf, we'll start with you for our last question. And so the question from our listener is, in your opinion, what is the best way to educate the general public, children, seniors, adults, on cybersecurity hygiene? Not just staying safe, but risk. So if we all take a go at this one, is that okay, Wolf? We start with you.
Sure.
Best way to educate.
The best way, I mean, there are a lot of different approaches. I think that one thing that we do in our office is we just try to we have outreach to public schools and to various organizations to try to teach young people about the various risks that they face online. And the earlier panel, there's an issue brought up of language accessibility, and that's something that we have to, when we go out in the New York public schools, we're trying to find agents who can speak various different languages to address the threats that kids face online. So it's a challenge, but that's one way that we're doing it, is through those kinds of meetings. I think just I don't want, people shouldn't, obviously don't want to live their life sort of feeling paranoid, but just that understanding that truly everyone is at risk in some way, particularly, and we just see it through email and social media constantly. And just to be a little bit more careful, where seems like there's a lot of mislaid trust in some of those social networks. So I guess just educating people and getting them to exercise more caution. That's all.
Well, thanks. I will tell you, when I go talk to my 10 and 12-year-old, I'm taking their phones when I get home, and I'm going to tell them I talked to the FBI and they told me to check. So I'm going to do that. Okay, and then like a lightning round. Justin, do you want to share best way to educate for our listener?
Yeah, I actually did this with my son, who decided he always liked to click on everything. He has his gaming PC. So one day I unplugged it and told him that since he had been clicking on things, that he had put malware into his system, and then I'd fix it. And so, but he had to wait over a week before I turned it back on and told him that's what happens when you click on things. So I think, looking at the applications that they're using, all their devices, and try to relate that back to, what happens if, you can't play Xbox for a week, or you can't jump on your, play your games on your phones, and, just kind of from a basic elementary style of just really kind of having them understand, the impact it has on them. And that's obviously that's a different impact, that it has on them than it would us. But
okay, well, I love a Die Hard move. That's a Die Hard. All right, we're on a quick time thing. I think anyone want to share a last tad bit of how you would educate before we, say goodbye to everyone listening? Best way to stay educated.
I guess to sort of piggyback off of what Justin said, which was absolutely hilarious and ruthless, by the way. My sympathies to your children, but well done. I think that the main point is to meet people where they are. So asking the question, what do folks care about? In Justin's child's case, video games, but for other folks, it'll be financial data, or whether or not they can access their, church sermons without somebody, Zoom bombing their conversations, or just security of their academic records or their healthcare records. Like, I think it's just a matter of really thinking through who the population is, who the consumer of the information is, and then asking very concretely, what do they care about and how is that at risk? And then communicating that.
I think so elegant. Meet people where they're at, right? We can probably all make a commitment to that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I definitely walked away more educated in some to-dos, and I know our viewers did, but thank you for all the work that you're doing every day to really keep us safe. And so thank you very much. And thank you to City and State. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for moderating that great discussion. It seemed like you folks could have just gone on and on. There's so much to talk about, really fascinating stuff. Perhaps next year we'll have you back as the Fab 7. It was that good. Thank you all. Again, I'll give you a little clap from my apartment in lieu of audience applause. And that is going to do it for our event. That is the third and final discussion. Before I let you go, I just had a few things I wanted to throw out there. First of all, again, our beloved sponsors, we couldn't have done it without you. They include CDW, Berkeley College, Celebrite, Data Miner, Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, Core Light, Inc., Splunk, and SWAC, Secure Worker Access Consortium. Thank you so much. We're so grateful for you helping us to put on this great event. And let's keep the conversation going. Please join us on Wednesday, July 28th at 5 p.m. as we honor our Bronx Power 100. Registration is free and can be found on our website, cityandstateny.com, and in the chat function just below. And then on Wednesday, August 11th at 5 p.m., we're going to Kings County. Yes, it's our Brooklyn Power 100. Registration is free and can be found on our website and in the chat. Again, that website is stateny, like New York.com. And then on Tuesday, August 17th, it's our annual education summit at 1 p.m. Is registration free? You betcha. It can be found right on our website and in the chat. Again, thank you to all of our sponsors. If you haven't signed up already, I strongly recommend you go to our website and sign up for First Read. Keep you updated every morning and evening with what's going on in New York City and state politics. I'm Zach Williams, Senior State Politics Reporter for City and State. Catch you next time.